So, let's just call my friend Lexi, and I'll go by Mila for this story. We knew each other back in Vietnam, and the original plan was to study abroad in the US together, living in the same city and everything, but you know how things go. She got pressured by her family to stay in a neighboring state, and I ended up in Houston, Texas. We kind of drifted apart for about a year, just dropping random Facebook comments here and there, until early 2020 when she suddenly messaged me out of nowhere, frantically asking if I knew any Vietnamese black magic or charms to get rid of ghosts. I remember staring at my phone screen in my apartment, totally confused. I mean, we hadn't had a real conversation in over 12 months, and suddenly she was hitting me up about the paranormal. I immediately texted back asking what was going on and if she was okay, but she wouldn't give me any details. She just typed that she was too terrified to even put it into writing. Like, she was genuinely convinced that if she typed out what was happening, whatever was bothering her would somehow know and punish her for it. That level of paranoia, it really sets off alarm bells in your head, you know? I asked her if it was really that serious, and she just sent back this vague confirmation that she was dealing with something completely messed up. Now, I was lucky enough to know a very well-respected Buddhist monk here in Houston. He's pretty famous in the community, constantly traveling to give lectures, so getting an audience with him is nearly impossible. I managed to pull some strings and got a hold of him, but he was insanely busy. He basically told me that he would be hosting a large vegetarian gathering at the temple on a specific date, and if my friend was really in trouble, she should just show up and he would try to squeeze in a few minutes to look at her. Just a quick consultation, nothing guaranteed. I screenshotted his reply and sent it to Lexi. She replied almost instantly, asking if she should just book a flight to Houston right then. I told her to come a day early so she could crash at my place, get some rest, and then we could go to the temple the next morning. So, the day comes, and I drive out to the airport to pick her up. Guys, I have never been more secondhand embarrassed in my entire life. I was waiting at the arrivals curb, and the second she saw me, she practically sprinted over and just collapsed into my arms, sobbing uncontrollably. She didn't even have any luggage, just a tiny beat-up backpack. She kept crying into my shoulder, thanking me for saving her and saying how scared she was. Mind you, this was just a quick 1-hour domestic hopper flight, not a reunion after a 20-year war. People were staring at us like we were absolutely insane, but she was clinging to me like a drowning victim. She was completely broken. The moment we got into my car and I merged onto the highway, she just spilled everything. She was so desperate to get this off her chest that she talked non-stop the entire drive back to my place. Basically, it all started when she had a massive falling out with her relatives. She had been living with her aunt and uncle for a few months, but the living dynamics just weren't working out. She's the type of girl who hates relying on anyone, so she just packed her bags, started taking the bus and Ubers everywhere, crashing with friends while looking for her own place on Facebook housing groups. She told me she found this listing from a Vietnamese landlord lady that seemed way too good to be true. She had to blink and reread the post like 3 times because it was a whole house, a 2-bedroom place with a master suite, a full kitchen, and a backyard, for less than the cost of renting a single, cramped room near downtown. We're talking suspiciously cheap. Lexi messaged the landlord, straight up asking if she had made a typo on the price. But the lady called her immediately, sounding super frantic and overly eager. She was like, no, I'm giving you a special hometown discount because you're Vietnamese and we gotta look out for our own people. The landlord even drove all the way to where Lexi was staying, picked her up, and drove her to the property for a viewing. But looking back, Lexi realized how incredibly sketchy that viewing was. Normally, when you tour a house here, the landlord unlocks the door and lets you wander around, right? Not this lady. She shadowed Lexi's every single step. She was literally glued to her side, pointing and saying stuff like, "Here is the kitchen, honey, and right here is the master bedroom," never letting Lexi stand alone in any room for even a second. But Lexi was young, naive, and desperate for a cheap place, so she just agreed to take it. And here is the weirdest part. A few days later, when Lexi and her boyfriend actually went back to the house to sign the lease, and hand over the deposit. That overly friendly landlord was nowhere to be seen. She never showed her face again. The very first red flag popped up right then. Lexi had a guy she was seeing. This American guy who didn't believe in anything spiritual whatsoever. He came over to help her bring some boxes inside. The moment they stepped through the front door, he stopped, shivering, and asked her if she had left the AC blasting on full freezing mode since the day she viewed the place. Lexi was confused because she hadn't touched the thermostat. They checked the utility box, and the main breaker wasn't even switched on yet. The house had no power, but the air inside was so bitterly cold, it felt like walking into a meat locker. He just shrugged it off as poor insulation, but Lexi said it was a heavy, damp kind of cold that settled deep into your bones. She ended up spending her first week alone in that house, and that's when the auditory stuff started. You know how American houses are mostly built with wood and drywall, so they settle and make noises. Well, Lexi kept hearing this agonizing, slow creaking sound. It wasn't just a random pop. It was this continuous, rhythmic shifting. Like every 30 minutes on the dot, you'd hear a loud screech of plywood expanding, and then another 30 minutes later, a sharp snap echoing down the hallway. She kept rationalizing it, telling herself that since she was just renting, she wasn't going to bother fixing anything. She would just wait until the place literally fell apart to call the landlord. That's what you do, right? You build a logical wall in your head so you don't lose your damn mind. But then the sleep deprivation hit. Lexi told me she couldn't sleep. And I don't mean she had insomnia where you just stare at the ceiling. I mean she would be utterly exhausted from working a late shift. She would lay down, close her eyes, and the second her brain started to drift off into unconsciousness, her eyes would snap violently open, her heart hammering against her ribs like she had just been shoved out of a moving car. And once she was awake, it would take her a full, agonizing hour just to calm down enough to even try sleeping again. She said she would come home from a grueling shift at 9 p.m., take a warm shower thinking she'd finally knock out, but the second her head hit the pillow, her eyes were just wired wide open. She was dragging herself to classes and her part-time job like a zombie, getting yelled at by her managers because she couldn't focus. It was during this state of pure exhaustion that things escalated. There was this piece of furniture in her bedroom that the previous tenant had left behind. It was this ugly, out-of-place vanity table with a mirror that totally clashed with the rest of the house, and Lexi hated it so much she was actually planning to have her boyfriend help her drag it out to the dumpster that weekend. One night, she was lying in bed, stuck in that miserable half-sleep state, when she heard a distinct, physical scraping sound. It was the sound of the heavy wooden stool being dragged across the floorboards right next to her bed. Just this slow, grinding noise that made her blood run cold. She slowly turned her head, and sitting right there at the vanity was a woman. Lexi described her as a Caucasian woman with these tight, curly blonde hair, almost like instant noodles. She was just sitting there, casually crossing her legs, going through the motions of applying lipstick. But the thing that made Lexi's stomach completely drop was the mirror. The vanity mirror was angled perfectly toward the bed, and Lexi could see the empty room reflected in it. There was no reflection of the woman. None. Just empty air. Now, Lexi was notoriously thick-skinned. Growing up in Vietnam, she had never seen a ghost, never experienced anything paranormal, and she didn't even know any real Buddhist prayers. She was so frozen in pure terror that she just held her breath, clamped her eyes shut, and jokingly muttered the only basic Buddhist protective chant she could remember under her breath, just hoping it would work. She waited maybe 3 seconds, just a quick, desperate blink, and when she opened her eyes again, the room was empty. The woman was gone. The stool hadn't even moved. If it were me, I would have packed my bags and ran screaming into the night. But Lexi, she gaslit herself. She convinced herself she was just having a stress-induced hallucination from not sleeping for a week. She just pulled the covers up and prayed for daylight. Anyway, the very next night was the breaking point. Lexi was terrified of being alone, so she invited her boyfriend over. She didn't dare tell him about the phantom woman because she didn't want him to think she was a lunatic. She just played it cool. asking him to come over to Netflix and chill and just have a normal night, but he got an urgent call and had to leave abruptly. So they basically just finished the Netflix, but there was absolutely zero chill. She was feeling a little buzzed from the alcohol, and the exhaustion was so heavy she didn't even bother changing out of her day clothes. She didn't even turn the bright overhead bedroom light off. She just collapsed face first onto her mattress, hoping the alcohol would finally let her knock out. She had just closed her eyes when she heard it. It wasn't a creak this time. It was this deep, guttural rumbling. Just this continuous thump, thump, thump that vibrated through the floorboards so violently she honestly thought there was a literal earthquake happening or a military convoy driving past her window. The rumbling stopped right at the foot of her bed. She slowly, painstakingly rolled herself over like a pancake to look. Standing right there, completely blocking the bedroom doorway, was a man. Lexi told me he was absolutely massive. She compared him to that old WWE wrestler, The Big Show. He was completely naked. Just this colossal, towering mountain of pale flesh. He had a completely bald head, a thick blonde beard, and his chest was covered in coarse, yellowish hair. He was just standing there under the harsh, bright bedroom light, staring down at her. Lexi's mind just snapped. She thought it was another hallucination. She squeezed her eyes shut, counted to 10, and popped them open. He was still there. She did it again, squeezed them shut, rubbed them, opened them. He was still there, and he was staring right through her. And then he lunged. He didn't just float over. He threw his massive physical weight directly onto her chest. Lexi said it felt exactly like a massive 300-pound buddy of mine had just decided to sit directly on her ribs. All the air left her lungs in a violent rush. She was pinned to the mattress, absolutely suffocating. And then the screaming started. Right next to her ear, this voice started shrieking. But it wasn't a deep, booming giant's voice. It was this high-pitched, piercing, almost hysterical screeching that felt like it was tearing her eardrums apart. Get out! Get out! Get out! Get out! Over and over and over again. Just rapid fire, deafening shrieks echoing inside her skull while she lay there suffocating. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She told me she was frantically moving her lips, just weakly mouthing, "Help, help, help," into the empty room, but her brain was just completely short-circuiting. She said she lay there for what felt like an eternity, maybe a full minute, just drowning in pure panic, thinking, "Get the fuck out. Just leave me alone." And then, snap. Everything just vanished. The weight was gone. The screaming stopped. The room was just quiet and bright. Lexi scrambled back against the headboard, gasping for air, and just sat there sobbing her eyes out until the sun came up. That was the morning she booked the flight to Houston and texted me. Hearing her tell me all of this in the safety of my car, in the broad daylight, I felt sick to my stomach. When we finally got to my apartment, she refused to go anywhere. I tried offering to take her to a mall, go boy watching, maybe get our nails done or grab a coffee, but she just wanted to sleep. She crashed on my couch at 6 in the evening and didn't wake up until 6 the next morning. It was the first deep sleep she had gotten in weeks. The next day, she woke up looking like a completely different person. The color was back in her face. We went out, grabbed some pho, and everything felt incredibly normal. But our appointment with the monk was at noon, and his temple was actually in a neighboring suburb just outside the Houston city limits, about an hour's drive from my place. We hopped in my car around 9:30 and started the drive. Now, this is where things get genuinely terrifying on a whole different level. Lexi had never been to Houston before. She had no idea how the roads worked. We pulled out of the Pho restaurant's parking lot. If I turned right, we would head back to my apartment. If I turned left, we would get onto the highway toward the temple. I took the left turn. We hadn't even driven a quarter of a mile down the road when Lexi suddenly stiffened in the passenger seat. Her voice completely changed. It got low, cold, and incredibly aggressive. She turned to me and demanded to know why I wasn't taking her back to the apartment. I told her we were heading to the temple to see the master. She immediately started swearing at me. I'm talking vicious, venomous insults. She grabbed the door handle and threatened to throw herself out of the moving car if I didn't turn around immediately. Honestly, for a split second, I almost gave in. I was thinking, whatever, if she's gonna be this crazy, I'll just drive her back to my place, let her hang out for a bit, and she can fly back home this afternoon. But I gripped the steering wheel and just kept driving, trying to ignore her while she berated me for an entire hour. When we finally pulled into the massive parking lot of the Buddhist temple, she refused to unbuckle her seatbelt. I literally had to walk around the car, unclip her, and drag her out by her arm. It was like dragging a toddler throwing a tantrum. I was pulling her through the parking lot, and she was digging her heels into the concrete, screaming at me. A few older Vietnamese folks walking nearby stopped and watched us. One auntie rushed over and asked if my friend had a shadow following her. I just nodded frantically. They actually helped me physically pull Lexi toward the main gate of the temple. The absolute second her foot crossed the threshold of the temple gate, silence. She stopped fighting. Her whole body just went slack. She blinked, looked around at the beautiful architecture, and smiled. She turned to me and said, "Wow, this place is gorgeous." I was panting, sweating through my shirt, and I just stared at her. I asked her if she had any idea what she had just put me through for the last hour, and she looked down, looking genuinely ashamed, and said something I will never, ever forget. She said, "I'm sorry. I knew what I was doing, but I was still me, but I wasn't me." We waited around until exactly noon, because the monk had just finished his lunch and was on his midday break, so he literally only had 15 minutes to spare for us. He finally came out to the courtyard, but when he saw us, he immediately told me to take a walk. He wanted to speak to Lexi alone. I was super nosy, so I only walked about 20 feet away and pretended to look at my phone while straining to listen. But he wasn't interrogating her about the ghost or performing some intense exorcism. He spent the entire 15 minutes asking her about her major in college, her hometown in Vietnam, and if she planned on marrying her American boyfriend. Just mundane, boring small talk. I was so mad. I thought this famous master was just brushing her off because he was too busy. After 15 minutes, he waved me over. We walked into his small office. He opened a dusty desk drawer and just started rummaging through a pile of tangled, cheap-looking jewelry. He picked up 2 or 3 necklaces, tossing the broken ones aside, until he finally pulled out a faded red string necklace with a chipped wooden Buddha pendant that was somewhat intact. He handed it to Lexi and told her to wear it. Lexi looked at it and thought it was absolutely butt ugly. It totally clashed with her manicured, Americanized vibe. But the second she slipped it over her neck, she told me she felt instantly feather light, like a massive physical weight had been lifted off her. The monk told her that the house wasn't safe and that she needed to find a way to break her lease and leave immediately. I asked him why he wasn't doing a ritual to destroy the ghost. That's when the monk looked at me with this dead serious expression. He explained that the entities residing in that house were Western demons. He specifically used the terms Lucifer and Satan to describe their origin. He said that as a Buddhist monk, his chants and sutras wouldn't do squat to them, just totally different domains, basically. He said that the 2 entities, the woman and the giant man, were currently standing right outside the temple gate, waiting for Lexi to come out so they could attach themselves to her again. The reason he spent 15 minutes making small talk in the courtyard was to deceive them. He knew the demons couldn't hear what he was saying from outside the gates. They could only see him. He wanted them to think he was performing a long, complex banishing ritual so they would be intimidated. The red string he gave Lexi was just a localized ward. It wouldn't destroy the demons, but it would create a barrier so they couldn't physically touch her body anymore. Lexi flew back home that same day, and the ward worked. The sleep paralysis stopped. The giant man never appeared again. She said the very first night she was back, she actually woke up at 2 a.m. craving food, and she happily walked around the dark house cooking instant ramen without a single ounce of fear. But because the demons couldn't torment Lexi physically anymore, they took their rage out on the house itself. Within a week of her returning with that necklace, the house started rapidly deteriorating. It was basically speed running its own demolition. Swarms of roaches and termites suddenly infested the walls. The wooden ceiling panels in the living room literally caved in and crashed onto the floor. When she walked up the wooden porch steps, her foot broke straight through the rotting wood. The house was aggressively decaying around her, literally trying to force her out. She used the severe structural damage to threaten the landlord with a lawsuit and a public shaming on the local Facebook groups, and she actually got her full deposit back. She moved out that same month and ended up renting a tiny, cramped room in a mobile home with some roommates. But she didn't care. She said she would rather live in a closet with other people than ever step foot in a cheap, empty house again. About a year or two passed, and Lexi actually made it a point to go back to the temple to return the amulet to the monks there. She finally figured out why the master had handed her something that looked like a piece of cheap, second-hand junk. Apparently, the monks just lend out these protective items to anyone going through some serious spiritual trauma, and once the coast is clear, you bring them back. They just keep circulating the same blessed charms to whoever needs them next, proving that the magic, or whatever you want to call it, doesn't wear off. So yeah, I guess I'm just rambling at this point, but I really appreciate you guys sticking around to listen to this chaotic mess. Just be careful out there, all right? Don't blindly trust a deal just because someone claims to be from your hometown, and if a house feels dead cold when the power is off, just walk away. Stay safe, guys. Back in '92, right after I graduated, I got assigned to the maternity ward at this provincial hospital down south. And man, the facilities were just awful. We didn't have those bright white lights everywhere like you see now. It was all these dim yellow halogen bulbs that made everything look incredibly sickly. I remember the cleaning staff would just do a half-assed job, leaving these faded black bloodstains on the walls that looked absolutely terrifying at night. Because of that, I was terrified of the dark and always begged the head nurse to just let me do the morning shifts, even if it meant clocking in at 4 a.m. Just to give you some context, this place was in Anjiang, right around the Long Suyen area. And honestly, before I really get into the weeds of this, I need to ask a massive favor from anyone listening right now. If any of you are in the medical field, or if you've ever experienced a physical, agonizing pain that you knew deep down didn't belong to your own body, like a spirit literally hijacking your nervous system to make you feel exactly how they died, please drop a comment and let me know. I just need some kind of validation to know I'm not completely losing my mind for believing this is what happened to me. Anyway, let me walk you through how my absolute nightmare actually started. I had only been working at this hospital for about 6 months. I was a total rookie, you know? And there was this senior attending doctor who was basically my mentor. She was in her 40s, incredibly skilled, and someone I looked up to massively. Well, one afternoon, I was literally packing up my bag, getting ready to clock out before the sun set, and she pulled me aside. She practically begged me to cover her night shift. She told me she had this huge family death anniversary the next day, and since she lived alone, she had to be up at 2 a.m. plucking chickens and cooking, so she desperately needed someone to just physically be there to cover her attendance. She swore up and down that I wouldn't have to lift a finger. I could just go straight to the on-call room and sleep the entire night. I really didn't want to. My intuition was screaming at me to say no, but she was my superior, and back then, hospital hierarchy was no joke. I was so desperate to stay on her good side that, like an absolute idiot, I agreed. I went home, took a quick shower, had dinner with my folks, and told my mom I was pulling an all-nighter. She was surprised, but I just brushed it off. By the time I pedaled my bike back to the hospital, it was around 7 p.m., and honestly, the vibe wasn't nearly as bad as I thought it would be at first. There were about 8 of us on duty that night, split into 2 teams. Usually the day shifts were incredibly strict and stressful, with doctors yelling and patients crying, but the night crew was surprisingly chill. We rarely had patients coming in that late, so everyone just gathered around the main nurse's station. We were eating some guava dipped in salt and pepper, peeling fruit, and someone had brought this old beat-up cassette player. We were just sitting there under those sickly yellow lights, listening to late-night storytelling FM radio shows. It was actually really cozy. The static from the radio kind of acted like white noise, and we were just hanging out, shooting the breeze. But then, the clock hit around 1:15 a.m., or maybe closer to 1:30. My memory of the exact minute is blurry, and the exhaustion just slammed into us like a freight train. The hospital got dead silent. The radio was turned off, and almost everyone decided to go catch some sleep in the on-call room. Now, this room was situated right next to the operating theater. They designed it like that so we could sprint over if there was an emergency bleeding out on the table. Usually, during a normal shift, only 2, maybe 3 nurses slept in there at a time, so it felt spacious enough. But that night, for some weird reason, all 6 or 7 of us decided to pile in there at once. The beds were these incredibly old, creaky wooden frames, barely wide enough for 1 person, let alone 2. But since it was so crowded, I had to share a bed with another nurse. Let's call her Harper. Because I was the junior, I took the outside edge. That meant my left shoulder was practically pressed against Harper's back, and my right side was just entirely exposed to the empty aisle of the room. It was uncomfortable. The mattress was basically a rock, and the air was thick and stuffy, but I was so incredibly drained that I figured I could sleep standing up if I had to. I closed my eyes, and within maybe 10 minutes, I started drifting off into that heavy, murky space between being awake and asleep. That's when things took a turn. I was lying there, completely motionless, when I felt something cold, just barely brush against the knuckles of my right hand. It wasn't a draft from a window. It felt like actual physical fingers gently tracing my skin. And then, I heard a voice. It was this raspy, hollow whisper right by my right ear, just chanting this one word over and over in a weird, rhythmic loop. Come, come, come. Now, in my groggy, half-asleep state, my brain immediately went into denial mode. I thought, okay, Harper must be annoyed that I'm taking up too much space on this tiny bed, and she's trying to wake me up to tell me to move. It's insane how your mind will literally invent any mundane, bullshit excuse to avoid facing a terrifying reality. I was just mildly annoyed. I kept my eyes completely closed and mumbled out loud to Harper, asking her what her freaking problem was, and telling her that she didn't have to literally chase me out of the bed just because it was a tight squeeze. I waited for her to reply, or to shove me, but there was just this dead, heavy silence, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I turned my head slightly to the left, toward Harper, and realized she was completely passed out. I could hear her deep, even breathing. Her chest was rising and falling perfectly in sync. And that's when my stomach just completely dropped into my shoes, because the realization hit me like a physical blow. Harper was on my left, but the freezing touch and that whispering voice, it had come from my right, from the empty aisle. My heart started hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it was going to crack my sternum. I slowly, ever so slowly, turned my head to the right. Standing right there beside the bed was a woman. She was wearing a standard issue, hospital maternity gown. But the thing is, the second my eyes locked onto her, my entire body just shut down. Complete and total sleep paralysis. I tried to shoot up. I tried to scramble backward over Harper, but it felt like someone had poured wet concrete over my chest and pinned my shoulders to the mattress with these impossibly heavy, invisible weights. I couldn't move a single muscle. All I could do was lie there, my eyes wide open, staring at this entity. I tried to scream, to ask her what she was doing in the staff room, but all that came out of my mouth was this pathetic, muffled gurgling sound in the back of my throat. And then, she spoke again, but it didn't sound like it was coming from the air. It sounded like it was vibrating directly inside my own skull. Come deliver it for me. My water broke. It's time. It hurts so much. It hurts. I was just lying there, completely paralyzed, my brain screaming at me that this was absolute bullshit, that it was physically impossible. We didn't have any patients in labor that night. I had been sitting at the reception desk for hours, No one had been admitted, but before my brain could even process the logic of it, she started groaning. It was this deep, guttural, animalistic groaning of a woman in active, agonizing labor. And then, she spread her legs apart. Now, you have to understand something about the maternity gowns in provincial hospitals back in the 90s. Because the hospital was so severely underfunded, the fabric of those gowns was this incredibly cheap, paper-thin cotton. If a woman stood in front of a strong light source, that gown became almost completely translucent. It was practically a sheer veil. The hallway outside our sleep room had these bright emergency lights that were kept on 24/7, and the light was spilling through the open doorway, hitting this woman right from behind. So when she stood there, maybe 3 feet away from the edge of my bed, groaning and clutching her stomach, with her legs spread wide, the fabric pulled tight across her body. It was basically acting like a projector screen, and through that thin, backlit fabric, I saw the silhouette of her lower body. I really want to warn you guys, this next part is incredibly graphic, and just deeply fundamentally wrong. I saw, clear as day, a massive dark lump protruding from her lower regions. It was the silhouette of a baby's head, literally crowning, but it wasn't a normal birth. It looked like a shadow puppet show from hell. The head was just jerking from side to side, frantically twisting, practically clawing its way out of her body, ripping through her flesh as she stood there screaming in that silent, echoing way. I was so utterly terrified that my brain just broke. I couldn't look at the silhouette anymore, so my eyes just frantically locked onto this rusted metal screw on the leg of the bed frame next to her. I stared at that single mundane screw with everything I had, hyperfixating on the rust patterns, trying to convince myself I was just having a stress-induced hallucination. But the sounds, God, the sounds wouldn't stop. She just kept pushing and pushing, her hands pressing down violently on her own swollen belly. And then, the baby fully emerged. And honestly, if I had to measure it, the poor thing was tiny, maybe just 2 handspans long, and it dropped. I heard this sickening, wet snapping sound, like a thick guitar string being pulled to its absolute limit, until it completely snaps under the tension with a sharp, sickening thwack. It was the sound of the umbilical cord yanking taut, and then the baby was just dangling there, suspended midair between her legs, swinging back and forth, like a fleshy pendulum, just hanging by the cord. I completely lost my fucking mind. I couldn't breathe. My body started convulsing, just shaking violently like I was having a massive seizure on the mattress. Harper, the nurse sleeping next to me, must have felt the wooden bed vibrating. She woke up groggy, turned over, and according to her, she saw me lying flat on my back, my eyes practically bulging out of my skull, staring into the dark corner of the room while trembling so hard my teeth were loudly clacking together. She slapped my arm hard and yelled my name. The exact second her hand made contact with my skin, the paralysis shattered. The invisible weight vanished, and I shot up, throwing my arms around Harper, sobbing hysterically. I was just screaming that I saw a demon, that there was a monster right next to the bed. The other nurses bolted awake in a panic, slamming their hands against the wall to hit the light switch. The old fluorescent tubes flickered on, buzzing loudly, and the room was completely empty. There was no pregnant woman, no baby, no blood, nothing. Just the 6 of us, staring at each other in absolute, breathless terror. I couldn't speak. I literally had to be half carried out into the main reception area. I was sweating through my scrubs, hyperventilating, just aggressively wiping my face with a towel someone handed me. It took me a solid 30 minutes of just sitting there, shaking like a leaf, before I could even form a coherent sentence. When I finally managed to stutter out what I had seen, the translucent gown, the tiny baby dropping, the cord snapping, everyone went dead pale. Some of the older nurses who exclusively worked the night shifts were desperately trying to rationalize it, asking if I was just stressed, saying they had worked that ward for a year and never seen a single weird thing. But then, the old cleaning lady who was mopping the corridor overheard us. She stopped, leaned on her mop handle, and quietly told us something that scared the crap out of me. She had been working at that hospital since the late 1980s when it first opened. She told us that the room we were sleeping in, it wasn't originally designed as an on-call restroom. When the hospital was built, that room was an active delivery room. They had 4 delivery rooms total, but for some sketchy reason, years ago, the administration permanently shut that specific room down, stripped out the medical equipment, and converted it into a staff resting area, even though the hospital was constantly overcrowded and desperately needed the delivery space. She didn't explain further, but honestly, having worked in obstetrics, I knew exactly what that meant. Out in the rural areas of the Mekong Delta, we had a lot of cases of what we called dropped births, women who lived too far away and ended up giving birth in the middle of a boat ride or on a bumpy dirt road before they could reach us. It was incredibly dangerous. Most of the time, the babies didn't survive, and the mothers would hemorrhage to death if they didn't get cut open immediately. My gut just told me that woman had made it to the hospital, made it right into that specific delivery room, and lost her baby and her life in that exact spot. And whatever trauma trapped her there was so intense that they had to board the room up to hide it. The rest of the staff were so freaked out they told me to just go home immediately, promising they would forge my signature on the attendance sheet for the morning. I grabbed my bike and pedaled home in the pitch dark, terrified out of my mind, constantly checking over my shoulder to see if that dangling silhouette was following me. The next morning, the senior doctor who guilted me into taking the shift found out what happened. She pulled me aside, looking incredibly guilty, and apologized profusely. She told me to keep my mouth shut so it wouldn't cause a panic among the pregnant patients, but she assured me she would never, ever ask me to do a night shift again. And from that day on, whenever the night roster was drawn up, they literally crossed my name out. They just accepted that my spirit was too weak for the dark, and I thought that was it. I thought I had learned my lesson, paid my dues, and survived the worst of it. But I was wrong. 2 years later, in 1994, I broke my own rule. By this time, I had gotten a bit more experience under my belt. I wasn't just assisting in the delivery room anymore. I was also managing the recovery rooms where the new mom stayed. My aunt, let's call her Aunt Gemma, was admitted to our hospital to give birth. Now, Aunt Gemma had done a lot for my family when we were struggling financially, and my mom was incredibly loyal to her. So, my mom basically cornered me and laid on the heaviest guilt trip you could imagine. She begged me to take the night shift for the 3 days Aunt Gemma was staying, just so a family member could be there to get her hot water, check her stitches, and make sure the other nurses weren't giving her a hard time. I felt indebted, and it was my own family, so I reluctantly agreed. I swapped my day shifts and told the head nurse I'd be covering the postpartum wing. The first night went completely fine, but the second night, it was an absolute nightmare right from the jump. I was essentially the only nurse actively managing 8 different patient rooms. I was running ragged, boiling water on hot plates, changing IV drips, cleaning umbilical stumps for the newborns, folding gauze. By the time 2 a.m. rolled around, I was physically and mentally exhausted. But it wasn't just normal fatigue. Out of nowhere, I developed this blinding, agonizing headache. I'm not talking about a normal migraine or a lack of caffeine. It felt like someone had shoved a metal spike into my temples and was just slowly twisting it. My vision was blurring, and my head felt so heavy I could barely keep my neck straight. A few of the other nurses saw me violently rubbing my temples and looking like a ghost, and they took pity on me. They told me to go down to the ground floor break room and lie down for a bit, promising they'd listen out for Aunt Gemma and the other patients. Now, this ground floor break room was entirely different from the on-call room upstairs. It wasn't a bedroom. It was just a cold storage area where they kept 4 or 5 empty stainless steel stretchers lined up against the plaster wall. Nurses absolutely weren't allowed to sleep on the stretchers. If management caught you, you'd be heavily reprimanded. So if we wanted to rest, we literally had to flatten out dirty cardboard boxes on the cold tile floor and sleep underneath the stretchers, like dogs. I was in so much pain I didn't even care about the hygiene. I grabbed some cardboard, dragged myself under one of the metal stretchers, and collapsed onto the floor. I didn't even have a pillow. I just stacked my hands together, rested my cheek on my knuckles, and closed my eyes, praying for the throbbing in my skull to stop. The pain was making me dizzy, almost nauseous. I drifted into this murky, feverish sleep. And then, through the haze, I felt someone touch me. I was lying on my side, and I clearly felt two hands gently pry my own hands away from my face and place them down on my chest. Then, these fingers, ice-cold freezing fingers, started rubbing my eyebrows, slowly tracing the tails of my eyebrows and then working their way up to my scalp. They were massaging my head. At first, it felt incredible. The coldness actually numbed the throbbing pain, and the pressure was hitting the exact acupressure points around my temples perfectly. I honestly just thought one of the other nurses had come downstairs, saw me rolling around in pain, and decided to help me out. I just lay there, completely limp, letting them massage my scalp, feeling the tension drain away. But then, the movements started getting faster, more erratic. I felt the cold hands reach around the back of my head and aggressively unclip my hair. Back then, all nurses had to have their hair tightly pinned up in a bun. You would never ever see a nurse with her hair down on duty. The hands violently pulled my clip out, and my long hair spilled all over the dirty cardboard. I was still half asleep, groggy and confused, and I mumbled out loud, "Hey, go easy. You're gonna tangle it, and I don't have a comb down here." The second those words left my mouth, the hands went absolutely feral. They didn't just massage my head anymore. They started violently grabbing handfuls of my hair, scrubbing my scalp like somebody aggressively scouring a greasy, burnt pan. They were tossing my head from side to side, tangling my hair into these massive, painful knots. My eyes felt like they were glued shut with superglue. It took every ounce of willpower I had to force my eyelids open. I tilted my chin up, straining my eyes in the dim light to see who the hell was doing this to me. Squatting right on the floor above my head, right next to the caster wheels of the metal stretcher, was a woman in a vintage nurse's uniform, but it wasn't anyone I knew. I had worked at that hospital for almost 3 years. I knew every single face on every single shift. I had never seen this woman in my life. Her skin was this awful, suffocating shade of pale blue, like she had been starved of oxygen. Her eyes were completely bugged out, staring down at me with this unblinking, psychotic intensity, and her lips were pursed together so tightly they were practically white. She was just glaring at me, her freezing hands buried deep in my hair, violently shaking my head. Adrenaline flooded my system. I screamed in pure terror and tried to scramble backward, trying to sit up to defend myself. But the second I moved, she gripped my hair in both of her fists and violently yanked my head backward, keeping me pinned down. I tried to sit up again. She yanked my hair backward again, jerking my neck. It was just this brutal mechanical rhythm. I would push myself up, and she would violently pull me back down. The pain in my scalp was excruciating. I started screaming at the top of my lungs, "Help me! Somebody help me!" I heard footsteps thundering down the hall. A few of the nurses from the front desk had heard me screaming and came sprinting into the room, slapping the light switch on. The moment the fluorescent lights buzzed to life, I heard this sharp, metallic, clattering sound echoing around the room, and the heavy, suffocating pressure on my head vanished into thin air. But I couldn't sit up. My head was completely stuck to the floor. The nurses rushed over, crouching down next to me, asking me what the hell was going on and why I was screaming like I was being murdered. I was just crying hysterically, pointing at the empty space above me, sobbing that a ghost had attacked me, that a dead nurse was trying to rip my hair out. They told me to calm down and stay perfectly still. When they checked behind my head, they realized why I couldn't move. During the struggle, my long hair had been aggressively twisted and threaded through the caster wheels of the metal stretcher and then wrapped tightly around the rusted iron frame. It was completely, impossibly tangled. It took 3 nurses working together to try and untangle me. They were pulling and yanking, but the knots were so tight and woven so deeply into the mechanism of the wheel that they couldn't get it free. Eventually, after 15 minutes of me crying on the dirty floor, one of them had to go find a pair of surgical scissors. They had to cut a massive chunk of my hair off just to physically free me from the stretcher. For a girl in the 90s, having a huge chunk of your long hair hacked off like that was devastating. I was holding the severed clump of my own hair in my trembling hands, just weeping uncontrollably as they dragged me out of the room and back to the brightly lit reception desk. None of the nurses working that night had any idea what had just happened. They were just as terrified as I was. They let me sit at the desk, shaking and crying, refusing to be left alone until the sun finally came up. A few days later, Aunt Gemma was discharged, and I immediately went back to my day shifts. My horrific headache had completely vanished the moment I left that hospital, the morning after the attack. It never came back. About a week later, an older male doctor pulled me aside in the hallway. He had heard the rumors about what happened to me in the ground floor break room, about my hair getting tangled and the mysterious, blinding headache. He looked at me with this very grim expression and asked if the headache had felt like a sudden, unnatural pressure in my temples. I just nodded. Then he told me the dark history of that room. Back in the late 1980s, when the hospital was severely understaffed and overflowing with patients, the nurses were working themselves to the bone. There was this one young nurse, only in her early 20s. One night, during a particularly grueling shift, she went to this exact doctor and complained of a sudden blinding headache. She said her face was twitching uncontrollably and her limbs felt completely weak. The doctor just assumed it was extreme fatigue and told her to go down to the storage room on the ground floor and lie down on some cardboard to rest. She went down there. An hour later, when they needed her to dispense medication, she didn't answer the intercom. The doctor went down to check on her and found her lying dead on the floor. She had suffered a massive, fatal stroke right there on the cardboard, right next to the stretchers. When he told me that, the puzzle pieces just slammed together in my mind, and I felt physically sick to my stomach. It wasn't just a random ghost attack. That spirit had latched onto me from the very beginning of my shift. That unnatural, agonizing headache wasn't a medical issue, it was her. She was possessing me, forcing me to physically experience the exact symptoms she felt right before she died. She made me feel her stroke. She made me go down to that exact room, lie in that exact spot, and reenact her final, painful moments. She wanted me to suffer the way she did. Looking back, the realization that a spirit can literally hijack your nervous system and force you to feel their fatal pain is something that haunts me to my core. I'm just so grateful I survived it. But seriously, thank you all for listening to me ramble on about this. Stay safe out there and trust your gut if a place feels wrong. That second incident was the final straw for me, and I swore to myself and my family that my graveyard shift days were officially over. I remember looking my mom dead in the eye and telling her that even if she was the one in the hospital bed, she'd have to settle for me visiting in the morning. My nerves just couldn't handle the paranormal baggage that came with the dark, and I wasn't about to tempt fate a third time. To this day, with over 30 years of experience under my belt, my name is still the first one crossed off the night roster. If I remember correctly, it's right after the holidays in 2018, back when I was just finishing up my senior year of high school. My aunt, my mom's younger sister, got into a scooter accident and shattered her leg, ending up in a sights-on hospital to get a bunch of metal hardware installed. She was constantly talking about how incredibly kind her doctor was during her stay, though I just kinda tuned it out. Then summer rolled around, and she had to go back in for a few days to get the metal taken out, which is when my mom made me go stay the night with her, since my aunt didn't have a husband or kids to help out. I was 18 years old at the time. The absolute last thing any 18-year-old wants to do during their summer vacation is sleep on a rock-hard canvas cot in a depressing hospital room. But my mom isn't the kind of person you can argue with, so I packed a small bag, grabbed my phone charger, and dragged myself down to the hospital around 7 p.m. that first evening. Saigon in July is just brutally hot. It's that thick, sticky kind of heat where you step outside and immediately feel like you need another shower. But the second you walk through those sliding glass doors into the hospital lobby, you get hit with this blast of overworked air conditioning mixed with the harsh chemical smell of industrial bleach and old rubbing alcohol. It's a very specific smell that just instantly puts a knot in your stomach. I made my way up to my aunt's room on the 3rd floor. It was a standard shared room, but thankfully it wasn't too crowded that night. I brought her some dinner that my mom had packed, and when I sat down next to her bed, I noticed that her eyes were completely red and glassy. She looked like she had just been crying her eyes out right before I walked in. I asked her if the new pain meds were making her nauseous or if her leg was hurting her too much. She just shook her head, wiped her eyes quickly, and mumbled that she was just feeling a little down and that it was nothing to worry about. My aunt has always been a very introverted person. She keeps everything bottled up inside, even from our own family, so I knew pushing her to talk about her feelings was going to be a total waste of time. I just nodded and told her to eat her food while it was still warm. By the time 10 p.m. rolled around, or maybe it was closer to 11 p.m. since the nurses had already done their final rounds and turned off the main overhead lights, my aunt was fast asleep. Her breathing was heavy and rhythmic. I was sitting on my little folding cot right next to her bed, staring at my phone. Like any normal high school kid, I was completely addicted to mobile games. At the time, I was heavily into this multiplayer battle arena game, basically like League of Legends for your phone. I reached into my pocket to grab my Bluetooth earbuds so I could hop on a voice call with my friends and start grinding some ranked matches, but my pocket was empty. I had left them sitting on my desk at home. I cursed under my breath. Playing a competitive team game completely muted is incredibly frustrating because you can't hear the audio cues when an enemy is sneaking up on you. But I also knew I couldn't play with the volume on inside the room. My aunt needed her rest, and I didn't want to be that annoying relative who wakes up the whole ward. So I grabbed my phone, quietly stepped out of the room, and gently pulled the heavy wooden door shut behind me. The hallway was almost completely deserted. They dimmed the lights in the corridors at night, leaving only these sparse fluorescent tubes humming every 20 feet or so. Half of them were flickering, casting these long, stretched-out shadows across the shiny linoleum floor. It was quiet. Too quiet, honestly. Just the low, mechanical drone of the central air vents and the occasional distant beep of a heart monitor from somewhere down the hall. I found a spot on the floor right next to my aunt's door. I sat down, pressed my back against the cool plaster wall, stretched my legs out, and booted up the game. I turned my phone volume up to exactly 50%. That felt like a safe compromise. It was loud enough for me to hear the game, but I figured the thick hospital walls would block the noise from reaching my aunt. If you have ever played those types of games, you know exactly how loud and chaotic the sound design is. It's just a constant barrage of clashing swords, magical explosions, gold coins clinking, and this loud announcer voice booming every time someone gets taken down. On top of that, I was highly invested in the match. I was whispering aggressively at my screen, basically talking to my teammates even though they couldn't hear me. I was saying stuff like, "Hey, push the top lane. Watch out, they're coming down mid. Let's go take the boss monster now." I was completely dialed in. The real world around me just entirely faded away into the background. I had been sitting there for maybe 5 or 7 minutes when the sound started. I heard this very distinct, hurried clicking sound echoing down the hallway like the hard plastic heels of dress shoes, striking the floor tiles with this sharp click, 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 getting louder and closer by the absolute second. Now, I was sitting in the middle of a major city hospital. Doctors and nurses walking fast down a hallway at midnight is the most normal thing in the world. I didn't even look up from my screen. I just kept mashing the buttons on my phone, totally absorbed in trying to defend my virtual base. I really couldn't have cared less about whoever was walking by. That was until the footsteps stopped right next to me. I'm not exaggerating. They stopped completely dead, right beside my legs. Out of the very bottom corner of my peripheral vision, just past the edge of my glowing phone screen, I could see a pair of stark white slacks, the exact kind of professional white trousers that doctors wear under their lab coats. I stayed looking down at my phone. I figured a nurse was just pausing to check a chart on the door or something. I even kept playing, trying to be a bit more polite by lowering my voice and leaning into the phone mic, whispering stuff like, "I'm down mid right now, I'm down mid," while a few seconds passed in total silence. Then, a voice spoke right above my head. "Kid, it's late. You are being too loud. How is your aunt supposed to rest?" The voice was stern but very calm. It sounded exactly like a disappointed teacher. I immediately felt a flush of embarrassment. I paused my game and looked up to apologize. Standing over me was a female doctor. I got a very clear, detailed look at her face under the dim hallway lights. She was an older woman, probably in her mid to late 50s. She had a somewhat wide, gentle face with a very distinct haircut. It was a short bob, cut perfectly straight right at jaw level. She was wearing a pair of round, rimless glasses that caught the reflection of my phone screen. I scrambled to turn my volume completely down to 0. I nodded my head politely and mumbled that I was so sorry and that I would keep it completely quiet. She didn't say another word. She just stared at me for a split second longer, then turned and kept walking down the hall past me. As she stepped past my legs, I felt it. It was a wall of cold air. Not just a slight chill from the air conditioning. It was a deep, biting, unnatural freezing temperature that instantly made all the tiny hairs on my arms stand straight up. It felt exactly like when you open the heavy metal door of a walk-in meat freezer and that thick cloud of sub-zero vapor hits your face. It literally made me shiver, involuntarily, honestly feeling like a literal walking ice cube had just casually strolled right past me in the middle of a sweltering July night. I sat there for a second, rubbing my arms, trying to rationalize it. I told myself that hospitals just keep the AC blasting at night to kill bacteria, and maybe she had just walked out of a particularly cold supply closet. You know how it is when you are alone in the dark. Your brain will jump through endless logical hoops to protect your sanity and keep you from panicking over something weird. I shook off the chill, looked back down at my phone, and realized my character had died in the game while I was distracted. Annoyed, I waited for the respawn timer. Since the doctor was gone, I figured it was safe to bump the volume back up just a tiny bit. 2 or 3 notches on the volume rocker, just enough to hear the faint sound effects so I wouldn't get ambushed again. I got completely sucked back into the match. About 4 minutes later, the enemy team started invading my side of the map. In the heat of the moment, I completely forgot where I was. I practically yelled at my screen. I said something like, "Oh crap, they're stealing my jungle. Get down here and save me." The absolute exact second those words left my mouth, the footsteps returned, only this time, they were so much faster and almost aggressive with this rapid clack, 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 clack stopping right at my side. "Why are you still making so much noise in a hospital? Don't you care about your aunt at all?" I physically flinched. I looked up, my heart doing a nervous little skip, and it was the exact same female doctor with the short bob haircut and the round glasses. She looked genuinely upset this time. I felt terrible. I quickly pressed the power button on my phone, turning the screen completely black. I apologized profusely, saying I was just leaving and going back into the room. She just stood there, watching me in complete silence. I didn't wait to see her walk away this time. I grabbed my phone, stood up quickly, and ducked back into my aunt's room, gently shutting the door, and I actually remember seeing the victory screen pop up on my phone because we had just won the match right as the room went pitch black. I stood there for a second, letting my eyes adjust. From the darkness of the hospital bed, I heard my aunt's voice. She asked me in a groggy whisper who I was talking to out there. I walked over to my folding cot and sat down. I told her in a low voice that I was just playing a game and a doctor came by and scolded me for being too loud. My aunt let out a tired sigh. She told me to just turn the phone off and go to sleep, since it was already late anyway. I agreed, feeling pretty stupid for getting yelled at twice like a misbehaving child. I lay down on the squeaky canvas cot, pulled the thin hospital blanket up to my chest, and closed my eyes. I'm a pretty deep sleeper, but hospital rooms are never truly silent. There are always weird, structural creaks, the hum of machines, and nurses walking around outside. I don't know exactly what time it was when I woke up. It felt like the dead of night, maybe 1:30 a.m. or 2 a.m. I woke up because someone was talking. It was my aunt. At first it was just soft, incoherent mumbling. I kept my eyes closed, figuring she was just having a weird dream caused by the pain medication. But then the mumbling turned into a very clear, distinct conversation. She was talking in her sleep, but she was responding to someone as if they were having a back-and-forth dialogue. I lay there in the dark, my ear pressed against the cheap pillow, listening to her side of the conversation. She was saying things like, "Yes, doctor, I'm just back here to get the metal plate removed." Then she paused for a few seconds, as if she was listening to a response. Then her tone shifted to something much more emotional. She sounded confused and heartbroken. She asked the air, "Why are you here? People told me you passed away. I missed you so much. Hearing the news made me so sad." My stomach instantly tied itself into a massive, heavy knot. A wave of ice-cold dread washed over my entire body. You have to understand, I was fully awake. This wasn't a dream. I could hear the hum of the AC. I could feel the rough texture of the blanket, and I could hear my aunt having a casual conversation with a dead person. I slowly, agonizingly opened my eyes. My folding cot was set up parallel to my aunt's hospital bed. There was exactly a 3-foot gap of empty floor space between the edge of my cot and the metal railing of her bed. Standing directly in the dead center of that tiny 3-foot gap, with her back facing me, was the doctor from the hallway. I stopped breathing, my brain completely short-circuited. It was the exact same woman, the same stark white pants, the same lab coat, the exact same short bob haircut resting just above her collar. She was standing close enough that I could have literally reached out and touched the fabric of her coat. One of her hands was gently holding my aunt's hand, resting on top of the blanket. Her other hand was slowly, rhythmically rubbing my aunt's shoulder in a soothing, comforting motion. It was the absolute textbook posture of a caring doctor doing a bedside checkup. But there was no sound. My aunt was lying there with her eyes completely shut, continuing her side of the conversation, answering questions that I couldn't hear. The entity standing right in front of me wasn't making a single audible noise. No breathing, no rustling of fabric as her hand moved. Just absolute, suffocating silence. That gut-wrenching, piss-your-pants kind of fear that hit me in that moment is almost impossible to describe in words. It's that feeling when your brain registers something so fundamentally wrong, so entirely against the laws of physics and reality, that your entire nervous system just screams at you to run. Fucking run. But my body was completely paralyzed. All I could do was stare wide-eyed at the back of this ghost's head. Suddenly, the survival instinct kicked in. I panicked, in a desperate attempt to break the tension, or maybe hoping that if I moved, she would turn around and just be a normal, living human doing late-night rounds. I violently shoved my blanket off and shot up into a sitting position on the cot. The exact millisecond I sat up, she vanished. There was no fading away, no cinematic smoke, just a silent, aggressive pop in reality, and the 3-foot space between the beds was completely empty. Less than half a second later, my aunt let out a sharp gasp and violently sat up in her bed. Her chest was heaving, and her eyes were wide open, darting around the dark room in absolute panic. She looked directly at me. I was sitting there, frozen, staring at the empty air. In a shaking voice, she asked me if I had just seen the doctor, standing right there. I could barely force the words out of my throat. I swallowed hard and told her yes. I told her the doctor was just standing there, and then completely disappeared into thin air. I admitted that I was terrified. I was an 18-year-old kid who had never believed in the paranormal, and my entire worldview had just been shattered in a matter of seconds. My aunt reached over and turned on the small bedside lamp. The harsh yellow light flooded the space, but it didn't make me feel any safer. She took a deep, shaky breath, leaned back against her pillows, and finally told me the truth. She explained that the doctor I had just described was the exact same woman who had taken care of her for 2 weeks after her horrible scooter crash earlier that year. Because my aunt was single and rarely had visitors besides my mom and me, She had felt incredibly isolated. That doctor had gone above and beyond her duties. She had bought my aunt meals out of her own pocket, sat by her bed to comfort her through the pain, and treated her like a sister. My aunt had grown deeply attached to her kindness. When my aunt had arrived at the hospital that afternoon to get her hardware removed, she had immediately asked the nursing staff if she could see that specific doctor to thank her again. The nurses had pulled her aside and broken the news. The incredibly kind, generous doctor had been battling a sudden, severe illness. She had passed away just a week ago, 5 or 7 days before we checked into that room. That was why my aunt was crying when I first arrived with her dinner. She had been mourning a woman she truly admired, keeping the grief locked inside her chest, like she always did. As my aunt explained this to me, the sheer gravity of what happened in the hallway finally crashed down on me. I realized with absolute certainty that the strict woman scolding me for being loud wasn't a cranky night shift worker, it was a lingering spirit. A ghost who was so dedicated to her patients, so protective of my aunt, that even in death, her soul was patrolling the corridors to make sure nobody disturbed her rest. That is why she felt like a walking block of ice. That is why she appeared in the physical world to discipline me and simultaneously manifested in my aunt's dreams to comfort her. My aunt tried to calm me down. She smiled weakly and told me not to be afraid. She said the doctor was a good person who loved her patients, and she was only scolding me because she cared. But knowing a ghost has good intentions does absolutely nothing to stop the raw physical reaction of pure panic. Anyway, after that whole thing happened, I was so freaked out that I literally pulled out my phone and played Catholic prayers on a loop just to make it through the rest of the night. I didn't sleep a single wink. I just sat up on that folding cot, clutching my phone, staring at the empty space between our beds, jumping at every tiny sound from the hallway. As soon as the sun came up the next morning, I packed my bag, bolted straight home, and absolutely refused to go back to that hospital to cover another night shift. My aunt ended up getting discharged about 2 days later without any issues. Once she was out and recovered, she actually managed to track down that late doctor's home address. She went over there personally to burn incense for her at her family altar, paying her final respects to a truly remarkable woman, since passing away in your 50s is just really tragically young. Honestly, I used to be one of those people who'd put on horror stories just to fall asleep, treat them like white noise, because I never actually believed any of it was real. My husband, on the other hand, hated it. He'd always tell me to turn that fake crap off because it gave him the creeps. But after what happened back in 2021, near this industrial park we moved to in Long Hao, well, let's just say I don't laugh at those stories anymore. To give you some context, it was right after the worst of the pandemic, and we were just driving around the Long Hao area looking for a place to rent when we saw this vacant room. The landlord was this old lady who acted totally weird, forcing us to wait by our bikes while she supposedly cleaned up the months of dust. I was actually standing out by the gate, blabbing on my phone to a friend, completely ignoring her. But my husband swore he saw her chanting and frantically scraping a paper ghost talisman off the door frame from like 30 feet away. To be completely honest with you, I should have just turned the bike around right then and there. But you have to understand the headspace everyone was in back then. The lockdowns had just barely lifted. We had been out of work for months, and we were just absolutely desperate to find a place close to the industrial park so we could start making money again. My husband, let's call him Gavin, he was always the superstitious one, the kind of guy who would refuse to watch horror movies because he'd get paranoid for weeks. Me? I was the exact opposite. I was a stubborn, hard-headed skeptic who believed that the only thing you needed to be scared of in this world was an empty wallet. So, when Gavin pulled my sleeve and nervously whispered that he just watched the landlady peel a yellow tiger ward off the door, which, by the way, is a very specific type of heavy-duty spiritual protection meant to keep screwed-up things contained, I just completely brushed him off. I actually rolled my eyes at him. I told him that people put up those cheap paper wards all the time for good luck or just to feel cozy, and that it wasn't a big deal. The truth was, the rent was only about $1 million a month, which is roughly like 40 or 50 freaking bucks. And for a space that close to the factories, it was an absolute steal. I practically shoved the 2 months deposit into the landlady's hands before Gavin could even protest, and we moved our meager belongings in that very same afternoon. The room itself was, well, it was exactly what you'd expect for 50 bucks. It was a long, narrow concrete box with a tiny kitchenette by the entrance, a cramped bathroom in the back, and this low-hanging metal mezzanine, a loft area, built right above the bathroom where you could put a mattress to save space. The air inside felt incredibly heavy, carrying this thick, metallic stench of old, stagnant water and trapped dust, but I just chalked that up to the room being boarded up for months during the strict quarantine. For the first few days, everything was aggressively normal. We cleaned the place top to bottom, bought a few cheap plastic fans to fight the suffocating heat, and settled into our new work routines. Gavin was still a bit jumpy, constantly looking up at the dark corners of the mezzanine, but I just kept telling him to get over it. And then, the first crack in the reality I was so desperate to hold on to happened. I don't remember the exact day. Maybe it was a Thursday, but Gavin had to run some errands on his own, early in the morning. We took separate bikes that morning. We both left the room around the same time, maybe 6:43 a.m. or something like that, and I distinctly remember being the one to pull the heavy metal door shut. I hooked the padlock through the latch, squeezed it tight until I heard that solid metallic click, and even gave it a hard tug, just to be absolutely sure. I have OCD about locking doors, so I know, that door was secured. We rode out to the main gate together before splitting up. He took a left to run his errands, and I took a right to head to my shift at the factory. I went to my shift at the factory, worked right through the morning, and rode my bike back to the room for my lunch break at exactly 12:15 p.m. When I pulled up to our unit, my stomach just did this awful, heavy drop. The padlock was hanging loosely from one side of the latch, and the heavy metal door was pushed open by about a hand's width, just hanging there, exposing the dark, unlit interior of the room. Instantly, my mind started doing gymnastics to rationalize it. I didn't think of ghosts. I thought of burglars. I thought of some sketchy guys from the neighboring units, trying to peek inside to see if we had anything worth stealing. I furiously muttered under my breath, completely blaming Gavin, convincing myself that he must have come back early, unlocked it, and then left again like a freaking idiot without securing it properly. It was pure bullshit, but it was the only explanation that made sense to my stubbornly logical brain. I pushed the door open, practically stomping inside, fully expecting our cheap rice cooker or our fan to be missing, but everything was exactly where we left it. Nothing was touched. The air in the room was completely stagnant and thick, baking in the midday heat, and honestly I was just too exhausted and sweaty to care anymore. I locked the door from the inside, making absolutely sure the deadbolt was thrown, and dragged myself into the bathroom to take a quick, cold shower. After I dried off, I just wanted to crash. The afternoon heat was brutal, so I turned off the harsh fluorescent tube light to make it easier on my eyes, leaving the room in this murky, suffocating semi-darkness. I lay down on the thin mattress we had placed on the ground floor, closed my eyes, and just let the drone of the plastic fan wash over me. I was hovering right on the edge of sleep when the ambient noise of the room seemed to just die. The whirring of the fan suddenly felt miles away, replaced by this absolute crushing silence that made my eardrums throb, and then, cutting through that heavy quiet, I heard this low, wet murmuring coming directly from the metal mezzanine, right above my head. It was the distinct sound of two adult men whispering to each other, but their voices sounded horribly degraded, like their throats were clogged with thick mud or something, and the sound of their words seemed to physically press down on the air around me. "She's back." My eyes snapped open in the dark. My entire body went rigid. I held my breath, straining my ears, desperately trying to convince myself it was just the neighbors talking through the thin walls, but I could swear on my life the sound was definitely coming from inside my own locked room, right above me. And then, the second voice replied, dragging out the syllables in this sickeningly playful, raspy tone. Want to pin her down? Let's pin her down and have some fun. The sheer creep factor of those words didn't paralyze me with fear. It ignited this blinding, absolute rage in my chest. Because, again, my brain refused to process the paranormal. In my mind, two perverted men had somehow snuck into my room while the door was cracked open earlier, hid up on the mezzanine while I was showering, and were now planning to rape me. I shot up from the mattress, fueled by pure adrenaline, and stared up at the edge of the mezzanine. Peering over the metal railing, silhouetted in the dim light of the room, were two human heads, just the tops of their heads and their eyes, staring completely unblinking down at me. They weren't moving. They weren't breathing. They were just fixated on me like a predator watching a trapped animal. I didn't even give them a second to react. I scrambled backward, tripped over my own sandals, threw myself at the front door, and yanked the deadbolt open, screaming my absolute lungs out. I spilled out into the bright, blinding sunlight of the courtyard, shrieking for help, yelling that there were men in my room, that two sick freaks were trying to rape me. Within seconds, the doors next door flew open. A couple of the older women and some off-duty factory workers rushed over, looking panicked. I was shaking so hard I could barely speak, just pointing a trembling finger at my open door, begging them to go inside and drag those sick creeps out. A few of the guys grabbed broomsticks and cautiously stepped into my room. I waited outside, my heart hammering against my ribs, fully expecting to hear a scuffle, shouts, the sound of someone being tackled to the concrete floor. But there was nothing. A minute later, the guys walked back out, looking extremely confused. They told me they had checked everywhere, under the bed, in the bathroom, and especially up on the mezzanine. The room was completely empty. There was no secondary exit. The small window was barred from the inside. There was absolutely no physical way two grown men could have escaped that room without walking right past me at the front door. The neighbors gave me these pitying looks, murmuring that the heat must be getting to me, or that I was just stressed from the new job. I just stood there, completely dumbfounded, feeling this cold, sickening dread finally starting to pool in the pit of my stomach. But even then, I refused to accept it. When Gavin came home from his shift that evening, I casually told him about the intruders, completely stripping the story of any supernatural context. I just said some guys must have snuck in and then somehow slipped past me when I ran out. Gavin, however, immediately went pale. He nervously suggested that maybe, just maybe, the things I heard weren't human. But I just immediately snapped at him. I aggressively rationalized the whole thing, arguing that ghosts don't use street slang, that spirits don't talk about pinning women down to have some fun. I used my anger to build this massive wall of denial, totally gaslighting myself into believing I was still safe. I was so incredibly wrong. A few nights later, the fragile illusion I had built completely shattered. Gavin had gone out after work to celebrate a coworker's birthday. I don't drink, so I just stayed back at the room. He ended up getting blackout, helplessly drunk. When I finally went out to pick him up and brought him back to the room, he was a total mess. He smelled overwhelmingly of cheap, stale beer and cigarette smoke, completely dead weight as I dragged him inside and dumped him onto the floor mattress. He didn't even bother taking off his clothes, just groaned and immediately passed out. I was incredibly annoyed. The smell of the alcohol in the small, unventilated room was suffocating. I threw a blanket over him, grabbed my towel, and went into the bathroom to take a shower, hoping the sound of the running water would drown out his heavy, alcohol-laced snoring. I stood under the cold water for a long time, just letting the steady, rushing noise clear my head. When I finally turned off the faucet and stepped out of the bathroom, drying my hair with the towel, I stopped dead in my tracks. Gavin wasn't lying down anymore. He was sitting dead center on the mattress in the pitch-black room, but he wasn't slouched or swaying like a blackout drunk person should be. He was sitting completely cross-legged, his posture unnervingly rigid, his spine straight as a board. His head was tilted slightly down, but his eyes were rolled up, staring at me through the darkness, with this blank, dead intensity that made every single hair on my body stand up. "Hey," I whispered, my voice trembling. "What are you doing? Just go back to sleep." He didn't move. He didn't blink, but his mouth slowly opened, and the voice that came out, it wasn't Gavin's. It was harsh, guttural, and dripping with this ancient, rotting malice that completely froze the blood in my veins. "Who the fuck did you chase out the other day?" Before my brain could even process the words, his body uncoiled with a terrifying, unnatural speed. He lunged across the distance between us, grabbing me by the hair with a strength I had never felt from him before, and threw me violently against the concrete wall. I screamed as the air was knocked out of my lungs, but he was instantly on top of me. He started swinging, bringing his fists down on my arms, my shoulders, my face, hitting me with this relentless, mechanical brutality, while that wrong, guttural voice kept screaming out of his mouth. "You chased us? You chased my brother out? We were here first. Who the fuck do you think you are?" It was absolute chaos. I was shrieking, flailing, trying to push him off, but it felt like I was fighting a concrete statue. My husband, who had never so much as raised his voice at me in our entire relationship, was actively trying to tear me apart, and the sheer horror of it completely short-circuited my brain. My screams must have been deafening, because suddenly, the heavy metal door burst open. The neighbors next door flooded in, shouting in confusion, trying to figure out what the hell was happening in the dark. And then, the craziest shit happened. 1 second, Gavin was pinning me to the floor. The very next second, as the neighbors turned on the overhead light, the weight vanished from my chest. I gasped, scrambling backward against the wall, looking wildly around the room. Gavin wasn't on the floor anymore. He was lying completely flat up on the metal mezzanine, staring blankly at the ceiling. I don't know how he got up there. There was no ladder. The railing was chest high, but he was just up there. The neighbors started yelling at him, cursing him out, calling him a piece of garbage for coming home drunk and beating his wife black and blue. The noise seemed to jolt him awake. He slowly sat up on the mezzanine, looking down at me huddled on the floor with my bruised face, and he just broke down. He started violently sobbing, totally sobered up, frantically swearing to me and everyone else that he didn't do it, that he didn't touch me. I was so traumatized I just asked the neighbors to leave so we could figure it out. Once we were alone, I sat on the far edge of the room, holding my bruised arms, crying quietly. I was trying to calm him down, assuming the alcohol had just triggered some psychotic break in him. I told him, "Look, don't cry. I'll buy some eggs to roll out the bruises tomorrow. You were blackout drunk. It's fine. When you're that wasted, you aren't really you, you know?" And the second I said that, he slowly lifted his head. Tears were streaming down his face, and his eyes were completely hollow. "Wait," he mumbled, his voice shaking. "You believe me? You actually believe that wasn't me?" He told me that when I went into the bathroom, he was half asleep, but the sound of the running water was suddenly drowned out by two voices whispering directly into both of his ears. "Let us borrow your body for a bit, man," one voice had rasped. "Your wife chased us out the other day." The second voice giggled. "Let us borrow your body. We're going to beat the life out of her." Gavin told me he tried to open his eyes, tried to shout, but he found himself completely paralyzed. And when his vision finally focused in the dark room, he realized why. There were two men lying on the mattress with him, one pressed tightly against his left side, one pressed against his right, and both of their heads were snapped at a gruesome, impossible 90-degree angle, resting on their shoulders so they could stare directly into Gavin's face from inches away. One of them had slowly raised a cold, stiff hand and clamped it over Gavin's mouth, and that was the last thing he remembered before waking up on the mezzanine. Hearing him say that, hearing the exact context of me chasing them out, which was exactly what I had yelled at the empty room days prior, it completely destroyed the last pillar of denial I had. It wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't intruders. It was them. The next morning, as we were frantically throwing our clothes into garbage bags to flee that cursed place, the older neighbor woman came over. Seeing us leave, she finally dropped the act and told us the truth. Back in 2020, when the COVID lockdowns were at their absolute strictest, two brothers had been renting this exact room. They caught the virus and were forced to strictly quarantine inside. For the first week, they came to the door to take the charity food the neighbors left. But then, the coughing stopped. The food piled up outside the door for nearly 2 weeks. When the authorities finally broke the padlock and went inside, they found both brothers dead on the floor. They had slowly suffocated in the suffocating heat of that locked room, completely isolated and alone. The landlady had known. She had hired some cheap scam artist to paste a tiger talisman on the door to keep their angry spirits pinned down, but whenever someone came to look at the room, she would peel it off so she wouldn't scare away the rental income. She deliberately trapped us in a concrete box with two entities that had died in unimaginable agony and isolation. We moved out immediately. But honestly, I completely lose my mind now whenever my husband comes home smelling like beer. The second he lies down next to me, I freeze up, staring at him in the pitch black, absolutely terrified that if I blink, I'll see those two dead guys lying on either side of him, with their necks snapped at a 90-degree angle, just waiting to borrow his body again. So, about 4 years back, I was pregnant with my first baby, and my doctor noticed my pelvic bone was kind of small, but he was dead set on me delivering naturally to avoid complications. Honestly, I should have known it was going to be a disaster when I checked into this big hospital on my due date, and my body just refused to go into labor. 6 hours of absolutely nothing happening, and the medical staff were just as confused as I was, so they hit me with this induction medication to force the whole process. And let me tell you, that was the moment everything just went completely off the rails. I don't know if any of you have ever had a bad reaction to medical drugs, but it just messes with your head so badly because you are trapped in a place that is supposed to heal you, surrounded by experts who suddenly look just as panicked as you feel. Almost immediately after they pushed that liquid into my IV, it wasn't just normal contraction pain. It was this agonizing, tearing sensation right in my gut. I remember lying there, clutching the thin hospital sheets, trying to gasp for air because my heart started doing these crazy acrobatics, beating out of my chest 1 second, and then slowing down so much I thought it was just going to stop the next. The nurses were hovering over me, checking the monitors, and my brain was just screaming at me that something was seriously messed up, but I couldn't even form the words. They kept checking my dilation, and despite the fact that I was writhing in this unspeakable agony, my water hadn't broken. There were zero actual signs of the baby coming. I was just suffering for absolutely nothing. Eventually, the doctor rushed in, took one look at my vitals dropping and spiking, and immediately called an audible. He told my husband that we couldn't wait anymore, that the natural birth was completely off the table, and they had to slice me open right that second. The panic in his voice, it just scared the crap out of me. Before I could even process what was happening, I was being wheeled down these blindingly bright hallways, staring up at those awful fluorescent lights passing by one. And then, I just blacked out. When I finally came to, I wasn't in a normal recovery room. I woke up to the rhythmic, synthetic beeping of machines and this heavy, suffocating smell of iodine and rubbing alcohol. I was in the intensive care unit. Apparently, during the emergency C-section, the combination of my horrific reaction to that induction drug and the massive blood loss from the surgery threw my body into severe shock. Right after they stitched me up, I started convulsing on the operating table. The doctors literally had to snatch my newborn son away, hand him off to my mom and my husband to take back to the regular room first, and throw me into the ICU just to keep me breathing. I spent 24 hours in that sterile, freezing room. 24 hours of just pure, non-stop pain, where the anesthesia was wearing off and every single breath felt like someone was dragging a serrated blade across my lower abdomen. But you know what hurt more than the physical pain? The absolute, crushing guilt. As a new mother, All you read about is how crucial that immediate skin-to-skin contact is, how you need to hold your baby the second they enter the world. And I was robbed of that. I lay there in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, crying silently, because I genuinely thought my body was failing and I was going to die, without ever seeing my little boy's face. The nurses kept coming in, adjusting my IVs, telling me in that overly calm clinical voice that everything was fine, that it was just a standard postpartum complication. But when you are trapped in your own head, feeling your life force barely hanging on, you don't believe a word they say. It wasn't until the next afternoon that they finally deemed me stable enough to be moved to a regular postpartum VIP room. That was the first time I actually got to look at my son. It had been over a full day since he was cut out of me. My mom brought him over, and I was so beat up and exhausted, so incredibly weak, that I couldn't even lift my arms to hold him. I had to helplessly ask my mom to gently place him on my chest so I could just feel his body heat. I just lay there, completely paralyzed by exhaustion, tears streaming down my face, just staring at him. It was supposed to be this beautiful, magical moment, but all I felt was this lingering sense of dread, like my body was a hollowed-out shell. By the time the second night rolled around, my husband had to go home to grab some supplies and take care of a few things, so it was just my mom staying with me. I was feeling a tiny bit better. At least I could somewhat prop myself up if I ignored the burning fire in my stitches. The VIP room was spacious, designed for 2 patients, but the other bed was empty. My mom, knowing how utterly exhausted I was, didn't want the baby waking me up if he got fussy. So she rolled his little plastic hospital crib all the way over near the entrance of the room. She unfolded a canvas cot right next to it, essentially creating a barricade between the door and the crib, and settled in for the night. I don't know exactly what time it was, maybe 1:17 a.m. or something, but the hospital had gotten stupidly quiet, like that dead of night kind of quiet where the only thing you can hear is the low hum of the central AC. I was drifting in and out of this feverish, medicated sleep until I heard this weird, dragging sound out in the hallway, almost like the wet smack of rubber slippers dragging against the linoleum tiles, just going thwack, scuff, right outside, over and over again, completely cutting through the dead quiet. I opened my eyes, my vision a little blurry, and looked toward the door. The door to our room had this large rectangular window of frosted glass, meaning you couldn't see details, but if someone stood right outside, the hallway lights would cast their shadow against it. And there was a shadow. Someone was standing completely still, right outside our door. They just stood there for a really long time, maybe 30 seconds, not moving, not knocking. Then, very slowly, I saw the handle turn, the door clicked open, and a figure stepped inside. Now my brain immediately tried to rationalize this. During the day, the hospital staff had told us that because we were in the VIP wing, they provided complimentary newborn care, meaning night nurses would occasionally come in to change diapers, clean the umbilical cord, or even clear the baby's bowels so the mothers could rest. So, seeing someone walk in at 1 a.m., I just assumed it was a nurse doing her rounds. I didn't say anything. I just lay there, heavily medicated, watching her. She didn't even glance in my direction. She walked straight past the foot of my bed and went directly to the crib near the door where my son was sleeping. But as I kept watching her silhouette in the dim light, something felt intensely wrong. The way she was moving wasn't gentle. She reached both of her hands into the crib, and she started doing this aggressive, repetitive motion, almost like she was scrubbing a stubborn stain out of a thick piece of fabric, or violently washing dishes. She was digging her hands in and just mashing down, over and over again, completely erratic and rough. My stomach tied into absolute knots. I kept thinking, what the hell kind of nurse handles a 2-day-old infant like that? It was so aggressive that a few seconds later, I heard my newborn son let out this awful, sharp gasp, like the wind had been knocked out of him, followed by a frantic, breathless cry. That sound triggered something primal in me. I tried to throw myself up, to scream at her, but my body was literally dead weight. I managed to barely lift my head off the pillow, straining my vocal cords to call out for my mom, but all that came out was this pathetic, raspy whisper. I was trying to yell at this woman, demanding to know what the hell she was doing to my baby, but I couldn't project my voice at all, and right at that moment, the woman stopped. She slowly turned her head and looked directly at me across the dark room. I will never, ever forget that face as long as I live. It wasn't a normal human face. The skin was this sickly, ashen gray, almost like wet clay, and it had absolutely no defining characteristics of age. She wasn't young. She wasn't old. She was just wrong. But the worst part was her eyes. They were bulging, completely unblinking, just staring right through me with this intense, malicious emptiness. It was the kind of look that makes your blood run freezing cold. We locked eyes for a split second, and then she just turned around, walked out the door, and pulled it shut behind her, with a soft click. The second the door closed, the paralysis broke. I started thrashing against the bed rails, screaming for my mom as loud as my ruined body would let me. My mom jolted awake on her cot, totally disoriented, asking me what was wrong. I frantically told her that a nurse had just come in and handled the baby way too roughly, begging her to check on him. My mom was confused, arguing that no one had come in, that she had been sleeping right there against the door and would have felt it open. But I was hysterical, telling her I saw it with my own two eyes. She quickly turned on the harsh overhead lights and reached into the crib to pick up my crying son, and I swear to God, as she brought him over to me under the bright light, my heart completely stopped. My son was a healthy, chubby baby, his newborn skin all flushed and red, but right there, on the center of his cheek, was a distinct, deep indentation. It was perfectly round, about the size of an adult thumb knuckle, pressed so deeply into his flesh that the skin around it was completely pale white, devoid of any blood. It looked exactly like an invisible finger was still pressing down onto his face. My mom gasped, almost dropping him. She immediately ran out into the hallway, yelling for the nurses on duty. A whole group of them rushed in, looking panicked, but when my mom demanded to know which night nurse had just been in our room, they looked at us like we were crazy. They explicitly stated that unless there was a medical emergency, no staff member was scheduled to do routine baby checks at 1 a.m. Furthermore, the nurse's station was literally just 4 or 5 doors down the hall, with a clear line of sight to our room, and they all swore on their lives that absolutely no one had walked down that hallway. Being in a hospital, you are entirely at their mercy. You are just a patient, and they hold all the cards. We knew they weren't going to take responsibility, and arguing would just make them label me as a hysterical new mother. So feeling completely defeated and utterly terrified, my mom just brought the crib all the way back, wedging it tightly between my bed and the wall. She then dragged her canvas folding cot and positioned it right at the foot of my bed, creating a literal physical wall. If anyone, or anything, wanted to get to my kid, they would have to step over her first. Once the lights were turned back off, the room felt suffocating. I lay there, my adrenaline crashing, leaving me to deal with the agonizing throbbing of my surgical wound. Every single muscle in my body ached, and I felt so incredibly weak that keeping my eyes open was a physical struggle. Eventually, despite the sheer terror radiating through my veins, my exhaustion won out, and I slipped back into a shallow, uneasy sleep. I don't know how much time passed, but it happened again. I was barely dozing off when that exact same wet, dragging sound of rubber slippers started creeping down the hall again, accompanied by this metallic rattling of the crib's wheels, which immediately snapped me wide awake. I didn't even have to look toward the door. I shifted my gaze, and standing right there in the dim light, leaning over my sleeping mother's cot, was the exact same gray-faced woman, and she had her hands firmly gripped on my baby's crib, slowly dragging it away from my bed, pulling it toward the hallway door. I can't even begin to explain what happens to your brain when you see something trying to take your child. You stop thinking logically, and you don't even feel pain anymore. The fact that I had a massive, stapled incision across my stomach just didn't matter at all. I was completely running on this blind mom instinct, and I just launched myself out of that hospital bed. And the weirdest part, I felt nothing. No pulling of stitches, no weakness, no gravity. I sprung up with the agility of a perfectly healthy person, leaping over the gap and slamming my hands down onto the edge of the crib, aggressively jerking it out of her grip. I started screaming at the top of my lungs. I was demanding to know who the hell she was, swearing at her, screaming for my mom to wake up and help me. I was making an absolute scene, a chaotic, ear-splitting racket that should have woken up the entire wing of the hospital. But as I was screaming, I realized the room was dead silent. My mom was still breathing softly, fast asleep on the cot right beneath me. The empty bed next to us was completely undisturbed. Not a single person was reacting to my frantic shouting. I stood there, gripping the cold plastic of the crib, both of my bare feet planted firmly on the freezing tile floor. I could feel the chill of the ground seeping into my soles. I glared at the woman, aggressively telling her to back off, that I didn't need her services, that she needed to get the hell out of my room. The woman slowly stopped reaching for the crib. She stood up straight, her grotesque, clay-like face tilting slightly, and she locked those dead, bulging eyes onto mine. When she spoke, her voice didn't sound human. It was this high-pitched, vibrating, metallic screech that seemed to echo directly inside the center of my brain. "Take a good look at who was lying on that bed," she hissed, pointing a long, gray finger behind me. "Go back over there and lie down. You're dead now. You have been dead this whole time." My brain completely short-circuited. I didn't understand what she was saying. My hands were still gripping the crib. I could feel the plastic. I could feel the cold floor. I slowly turned my head, following the direction of her rotting finger, looking past my sleeping mother, toward my hospital bed, and my reality simply shattered. Lying there on the mattress, tangled in the white sheets, was me. It was my physical body. I was looking at my own face, pale and lifeless, my eyes shut completely tight. My arms were resting limply at my sides, hooked up to the IV drips that weren't moving. I was staring at my own corpse. The horror that washed over me was indescribable. I felt like my brain was splitting in two. One half of me was still freaking out, trying to protect my baby in the crib, and the other half was just completely losing its mind, realizing that I was literally a ghost, floating in the middle of a hospital room. I was so incredibly light, weightless, untethered from the agonizing pain of my surgery. I kept looking back and forth, looking at my hands gripping the crib, then looking at my dead hands resting on the bed. I spun back around to face the gray woman, but she was completely gone. The space where she had just been standing was empty. Total panic set in. I let go of the crib and desperately tried to yell for my mom again, screaming her name over and over, begging her to wake up and look at me. I managed to get out maybe 3 frantic cries before it happened. It felt like a massive, invisible vacuum had suddenly opened up directly behind me. It wasn't a gentle pull. It was like getting sucked into a jet engine. I felt myself getting yanked backward through the air so damn hard, accompanied by this deafening, rushing sound in my ears, and then, slam. My eyes ripped open, staring straight up at the dark ceiling. Instantly, a tidal wave of excruciating physical agony crashed into me. My lungs felt like they were collapsing as I desperately gasped for air, choking on my own breath. The searing, burning pain of my C-section incision returned 100 times worse, radiating through my entirely paralyzed physical body. But as I lay there, suffocating and thrashing in my own skin, I forced my head to turn toward the door. I needed to know if I had just had a nightmare. I needed to know if I was just hallucinating from the drugs. And right there, illuminated by the faint light bleeding through the frosted glass door, was my baby's crib. It was no longer wedged safely between my bed and the wall. It had been dragged several feet across the room, sitting abandoned right near the entrance, exactly where I had physically fought that woman to get it back. I completely lost my fucking mind. I started hyperventilating, screaming for my mom with a voice that was finally physical and raw. She practically vaulted off her cot, turning on the lights, utterly horrified to see the crib moved. She dragged it back, and I was just sobbing hysterically, pointing at the door, trying to explain that the entity had come back, that it wasn't human. The commotion brought the nurses running in again, and my mom had to frantically call my husband to rush back to the hospital right that second. Eventually, the on-call doctor was summoned. After examining me and seeing my elevated heart rate and chaotic vitals, he calmly wrote it off as a severe case of postpartum psychosis. He explained it away, saying that the trauma of the emergency surgery, combined with the heavy medication, had caused a massive spike in my brainwaves, resulting in intense, hyper-realistic hallucinations and a brief period of shock. He completely dismissed the fact that the heavy crib had moved on its own across the room while my mother slept right next to it. We didn't argue. You learn very quickly that science doesn't have a checkbox for the paranormal. I forced my husband to just straight up quit his job to stay in the room with us, and I refused to let anyone turn off the overhead fluorescent lights for the remainder of our stay. I didn't utter a single word about the gray woman or the fact that I had looked at my own dead body, because I was absolutely terrified that if I acknowledged it out loud, that thing would come back to finish the job. The only logical explanation I can come up with is that the severe exhaustion pushed me into temporary clinical death, making my spirit literally step out of my failing body for a moment. I kept my mouth shut at the hospital, terrified of angering that entity, but the second I walked through my front door, I just lost it and bawled my eyes out for 24 hours. I became so paranoid that I'd hold my baby in a death grip until my mom literally had to pry him away, though, thank God, the fear slowly washed away as he grew up. So, this isn't your typical ghost story about a creepy hotel or a haunted lake in Dalat. This actually happened at one of those old-school acoustic music lounges. Just to give you some context, back in the day, before 1975, Dalat was like the ultimate playground for the rich and the military elites, so these lounges were built exclusively for them. I'm keeping the name anonymous, but this place was ancient. Anyway, back in 2017, when I was 17, I got dragged there by my parents. They aren't celebrities or anything, but my mom has this massive diva energy and loves singing, to the point where we have an actual stage with like 3 guitars in our house in Saigon. She knows all these old lounge singers across the country, so my job on every family trip was basically to be her personal cameraman. And that night in Dalat was supposed to be just another gig for me. I remember it was a really cold night. We were driving around the winding roads of the city at maybe 6:45 p.m. The fog was incredibly thick, the kind that sticks to your clothes and makes you shiver down to your bones. I was sitting in the back seat just staring at my phone, complaining about how bored I was. I really didn't want to go listen to music that was popular 50 years ago, but my parents were super hyped. My mom had been chatting with this local singer online for weeks, and they had planned this whole duet thing. When we finally arrived at the address, it didn't even look like a business. We had to walk down this really steep, slippery slope to get to the entrance. The moment I stepped inside that building, my nose was immediately hit with that heavy, undeniable scent of time. You know what I mean. It smelled like damp wood, old dust, and closed-off rooms that haven't seen natural sunlight in decades. It was the kind of smell that just settles into the back of your throat. The interior was incredibly dark. They were super stingy with the lighting in there. The only real light came from these tiny candles placed on each of the tables, casting these long, flickering shadows against the walls. The only bright spot in the entire room was a single, harsh spotlight pointed directly at the wooden stage up front. It felt like stepping into a time capsule from the 1960s. The walls were covered in faded wallpaper that was peeling at the edges, and I could even see thick cobwebs in the upper corners when the candlelight caught them. We sat down at a table near the front, snacking on some sunflower seeds they had on the tables, and my dad ordered some drinks. I think a single cup of coffee was roughly $20. That was a complete rip-off, but I guess you are paying for the whole exclusive live music atmosphere. The place was practically empty. There were maybe 8 or 9 people in total, including my family of 3. It was supposed to be peak hours for a music lounge, but it was dead quiet. You could literally hear the wooden floorboards creaking under the waiter's feet when he brought our drinks. A local singer was up on stage doing her thing, singing these old, slow Trin music and vintage bolero tracks. She was the lady who had invited my mom. After a couple of songs, this singer grabbed the microphone and announced to the tiny crowd that she had a special guest from Saigon with a beautiful vintage voice. She then looked right at our table and invited my mom to come up to the stage. Normally, my mom would just confidently strut up there and take the spotlight. She lives for this kind of stuff, but as she stood up and smoothed out her clothes, the singer rushed down from the stage and hurried over to our table. I already had my phone out. I was holding it up, recording the whole thing because that was my job. I figured they were just discussing what song to sing together or what key the band needed to play in. But through my phone screen, I noticed my mom frowning. Her eyebrows furrowed together, and she looked super confused. She just kept shaking her head side to side. The singer kept urging her, looking kind of desperate and pleading with her hands, but my mom flat out refused. After about a minute of this awkward back and forth conversation, the singer let out a heavy sigh, told my mom to wait at the table for a second, and literally jogged to the back of the lounge, disappearing behind these heavy velvet stage curtains. I lowered my phone and asked my mom what the heck was going on. My mom looked really annoyed and sat back down. She told us that the singer had asked her to go backstage and light some incense at a small shrine before stepping onto the stage. Now, my family is Catholic. We don't really have the custom of lighting incense for wandering spirits or local entities. My mom is pretty strict about it. She basically told the singer she wasn't comfortable doing that at all. The singer had insisted it was just a normal routine to make sure the performance went smoothly and to show respect to the venue. But my mom stood her ground. She told the lady that she could go light it herself if she wanted to, but she wasn't going to do it. So the singer had to go back there and do it for her. I remember thinking it was super weird and honestly a bit sketchy. We had been to dozens of these acoustic lounges all over the country, and nobody ever made us light incense just to sing one guest song. It felt completely unnecessary, and it kind of ruined the fun mood we had going. About a minute later, the singer came back out from behind the curtain, gave my mom a little nod, and walked back up to the microphone. My mom stood up again, and this is exactly where things started getting really screwed up. My mom was dressed to the nines for this occasion. She had this whole retro 70s vibe going on. She was wearing these tight trousers that flared out wide at the bottom around the ankles, and a pair of thick, chunky heels that my dad actually bought for her like 4 or 5 years ago, so she was completely used to walking in them. She had been wearing outfits like that since she was a teenager, so walking in those massive heels was basically second nature to her. She was a total pro at it. I raised my phone and hit the record button again. The walk from our table to the stage was really short, maybe 20 feet at most. For the first few steps, my mom was smiling. She was doing her little diva strut, swaying her hips because she knew I was filming her every move. But then, she suddenly stumbled. It looked like her legs just cramped up out of nowhere. She kept walking forward, but the way she walked got super stiff. She kept looking down at her feet and glancing around her with this panicked, uncomfortable expression. It looked exactly like someone was physically blocking her path or trying to grab at her ankles to trip her up. She finally made it to the single wooden step leading up to the stage. It was a really low step, covered in this cheap, faded red carpet. As soon as she put her foot on it, she just completely wiped out. She fell forward, catching herself hard with her hands on the wooden floorboards of the stage. My dad and I flinched, but she quickly stood back up. She laughed it off, making a quick joke into the mic about how she hasn't even had a single drop of alcohol yet but is already acting drunk, and the few people in the crowd politely clapped. But I could see her face up close through my camera zoom. She looked deeply unnerved. Her smile was completely forced. When she finally stood up there, and the music started, her performance was an absolute disaster. My mom is a genuinely fantastic singer. She has practiced these specific songs 1,000 times in our living room. But the moment she opened her mouth, she was totally off key. It was hard to listen to. She kept forgetting the lyrics, stumbling over words she knew by heart. She was looking around like crazy. her eyes constantly darting toward the dark area behind the red velvet curtains like she expected something to jump out at her. And the microphone kept glitching out. The local singer beside her sounded perfectly fine, but every single time my mom tried to hit a note, the mic would let out this piercing, ear-splitting screech that echoed through the whole room. It was that horrible, high-pitched feedback sound that makes your teeth hurt, and everyone in the lounge had to cover their ears. My mom would hit the side of the mic in frustration, try to sing again, and the audio would just cut out completely into dead silence. It wasn't a wireless mic either. It was a heavy, wired microphone plugged directly into the system, so it shouldn't have been losing connection like that. A guy had to run out from the back and hand her a replacement mic, but the exact same thing kept happening. Through all of this, I just kept filming. I didn't know what else to do. I had a nearly 6-minute continuous shot on my phone. I was zooming in on her stressed face, panning across the stage, catching the guitar player, zooming in on the drummer, just doing random camera movements to distract myself from how awkward the whole situation was. By the time the dreadful song finally ended, my mom looked utterly defeated. She looked like she wanted to cry from the embarrassment. She practically stomped off the stage, tripping a second time on the exact same wooden step on her way down. When she got back to our table, she didn't even sit down gracefully. She just dropped into her chair. Her face was completely pale, and her jaw was clenched tight. My dad immediately leaned in and asked if her shoes were broken or if the flared pants were getting in her way. She just violently shook her head and whispered that something felt incredibly wrong up there. She told us she literally felt unseen hands grabbing at her ankles and yanking forcefully on the flared fabric of her pants the entire time she was trying to sing. She said it felt like someone was crouching on the floor, tugging at her clothes to pull her down. But that wasn't even the worst part. She leaned closer to us and said that while she was struggling to sing, she clearly heard a woman's voice coming from right behind the velvet curtains. The voice was loudly mocking her. My mom said the unseen woman was telling her she was completely out of tune, that her outfit looked ridiculous, and demanding she get off the stage so a real singer could perform. My dad and I just stared at her in absolute shock. We had been sitting right in the front row, maybe 10 feet away, and we didn't hear a single voice. We only heard the acoustic guitar and that awful screeching microphone. My mom was so shaken up and angry that she decided to go to the restroom, to splash some cold water on her face and calm down. She handed my dad her purse and walked away into the dark hallway at the back of the room. She was gone for maybe 3 or 4 minutes. When she came back, she didn't look calm at all. She slammed herself down into her chair, her face red with absolute rage. She snatched her purse from the table and told my dad we were leaving immediately. My dad was startled and asked her what the hell happened in there to make her so mad. She told us that as soon as she went into the toilet stall and closed the door, she heard this loud, deliberate clicking sound of heavy heels walking into the empty bathroom. The footsteps stopped right outside her stall. Then, she heard someone violently pounding on her stall door. It wasn't a polite knock. They were slamming their fists against the wood over and over again, like they were trying to break the door off its hinges. My mom was startled, but tried to be polite, calling out that someone was currently using the stall, thinking it was just a drunk or rude customer. But then, the exact same voice she had heard whispering behind the stage curtains started screaming through the bathroom door. "You need to stop singing. You think you can just come up here and ruin my song? You aren't a real singer. You look pathetic in those clothes. You are too old for this. Just go home." My mom is usually a very calm and collected person, but her pride was heavily wounded. Nobody talks to her like that. She threw open the stall door, fully ready to confront whoever was harassing her. She said she stepped out and looked toward the sinks. Standing by the very last sink, about 10 feet away from her, was a woman. The lighting in the bathroom was terrible, just a dim yellow bulb, but my mom could clearly see the woman was wearing a deep dark blue vintage dress. It was the kind of thick, heavy fabric people wore decades ago. Her hair was styled in that massive curly 1970s look that poofs out and covers half the face. She had these sharp, piercing eyes, heavily coated in thick black mascara, and she was just glaring at my mom through the mirror. She didn't blink. She just stared, with this look of pure disgust. My mom didn't even yell at her. She was just so taken aback by how outdated and bizarre the woman looked. She grabbed her things, washed her hands in silence, while the woman kept staring, and walked straight out of the bathroom. When my dad heard this, he was absolutely furious. He is a very protective guy, and the idea of some arrogant local singer bullying his wife in a bathroom was complete bullshit and not gonna fly. He stood up, pushed his chair back, and immediately stormed toward the backstage area to find this woman in the blue dress. My mom and I panicked and ran after him, trying to calm him down. We found the local singer who had invited us standing near the audio equipment. My dad angrily approached her and demanded to know who the other woman in the blue dress was and why she was harassing his wife. The singer looked at us with wide, confused eyes. She swore up and down that she was the only performer hired for the entire night. She said the lounge hasn't been able to afford multiple singers in years. There were absolutely no other women working there. My dad was about to yell at her for lying, but the singer's face suddenly dropped. All the color drained from her cheeks. She swallowed hard and quietly asked my mom if she had seen a woman in a dark blue dress with big curly hair. My mom nodded, still looking angry. The singer closed her eyes, took a deep, shaky breath, grabbed a small flashlight from a shelf, and told us to follow her. She led us into the tight, confusing maze of thick curtains behind the stage. It was incredibly dark back there, and it smelled strongly of dust, old wood, and heavy incense. We walked past old microphone stands and broken chairs until we reached a tiny, cramped corner at the very back wall of the building. Sitting right on the floorboards, hidden away from the public eye, was a tiny, beat-up, rotten little wooden shrine. There was a rusted incense burner sitting in front of it, filled to the brim with gray ash and the stubs of burnt incense sticks. The singer knelt down on the floor, gently pushed the incense burner to the side with her hand, and revealed a small black and white photograph leaning against the back of the shrine. It was no bigger than the palm of my hand. My mom looked down at the photo, and she let out this choked, terrified gasp. She grabbed my dad's arm so hard I could see her knuckles turning white. I felt the blood completely drain from my face, leaving me freezing cold. I leaned in and looked down at the picture. Holy fucking shit. It was the exact same woman from the bathroom. The exact same massive curly hair. The exact same sharp, piercing eyes staring back at us through the faded black and white paper. The singer stayed on her knees and quietly explained the history to us. She said the woman in the photo used to be the absolute biggest star in Dalat back in the 1960s. She was incredibly beautiful and famous, but she was also deeply jealous and possessive of her stage. She hated whenever new talent came to town. She used to stand hidden behind the velvet curtains and whisper awful, nasty, messed up shit to the younger singers to make them panic and mess up their performances. She ruined a lot of careers that way, but her attitude made her a lot of dangerous enemies. The singer told us that one night, a rival performer hired some local gangsters. They stormed right into the lounge while the woman in the blue dress was performing in front of a packed crowd. They dragged her down and stabbed her repeatedly, right on that stage. The singer said the woman bled to death on the wooden floorboards before anyone could even get her to a hospital. She was only in her 20s. The singer looked up at my mom with this sad, tired expression and explained that ever since that night, 50 years ago, the woman still fiercely haunts the stage. She believes she still owns it. Anyone who wants to perform on that stage, whether they are a professional or a guest, has to light incense at her shrine to ask for her permission. If you don't show her that respect, she will step out from the shadows and ruin you. Because my mom had stubbornly refused to light the incense earlier, the ghost saw it as an insult and targeted her directly. The singer quietly told us that lighting a stick of incense doesn't belong to any specific religion. It's just a basic sign of respect for the dead. Hearing that, we didn't argue. My parents and I took the lighter, lit 3 sticks of incense, and placed them carefully in the burner. We actually didn't run out right away. To be polite to the singer, my mom forced us to go back to our table, sit there completely terrified, and wait through 3 whole agonizing songs before we finally packed up and left. Later on, when we were safely away from that place and finally back at our hotel room, my mom asked me for the video. She wanted to see exactly what we had caught on camera during that cursed performance. I tried to send the 6-minute clip to her on Zalo, but the app just wouldn't work. I turned off the Wi-Fi, switched to 3G, put my phone on airplane mode, and took it off, but it just kept giving me connection errors. Before we gave up on sending it, we actually sat there and watched the clip on my screen. The audio in the video was totally screwed up. You couldn't hear my mom singing at all. It was just the instruments and this horrible, static, hissing sound. But then, I got to the part where I was panning the camera around. At one point, I had zoomed into this dark corner of the stage where they kept all the heavy amps and audio receivers. I held the camera there for about 3 seconds. For the first second, there was nothing. But then, right there on the screen, a figure literally faded into the frame. It was her. The opacity was maybe at 30 or 40%, like a hazy, semi-transparent ghost, but you could distinctly see her deep blue dress, aggressively contrasting against the bright red velvet curtains behind her. She was just standing there, glaring daggers directly at my mom. We were so freaked out that we just locked the phone and decided to deal with it later. Fast forward a couple of days, our trip ended, and we got back home to Saigon. My mom wanted to show the video to her friends to prove she wasn't crazy. I unlocked my phone and went straight to my albums, but the 6-minute video was completely missing. The weird part is, the tiny 10-second clip of her just standing up from her chair was still there, sitting right where the long video should have been. The rest of it had just vanished into thin air. My mom got really mad, accusing me of accidentally deleting it, but I swear on my life I didn't touch it. It hit me right then and there that the woman in the blue dress didn't just mess with the stage, she wiped the proof of her existence from my device. I literally felt my knees give out. I'm probably the biggest hater of ghost stories you'll ever meet, and it's not because I'm a skeptic. It's because I hold a very real, very bitter grudge against whatever exists on the other side. Listening to that stuff just drags me right back into the ugliest chapter of my life. But I heard some scary audio playing in the house the other day, and for whatever reason, it pushed me over the edge to finally talk about it. I guess I just need to get this out of my head. The story of how my family was quietly hunted down without a single jump scare. It all started way back in 1989. We were living over in District 10 at the time, but then my mom had just bought this additional house in the Tan Binh district. It was tucked deep inside Bao Bang Street, over in District 11, down one of those narrow alleys that somehow block out all the chaotic traffic noise from the main roads. I actually had this motorcycle buddy back then who used to ride his loud-ass bike into our alley to hang out, and even he would always point out how unnervingly, weirdly dead quiet it was in there, compared to the rest of the city. If you walked in, you would probably just see a completely normal, slightly dated Vietnamese home. We had a pretty decent-sized family living there at first. Me, my mom, my dad, and my older sister. And the thing you need to understand about my family is that we were absolute clean freaks. Like, obsessive. The floors were always mopped with this strong, lemon-scented cleaner, the windows were always spotless, and everything had its exact place, except for one specific spot. We had this spiral staircase right in the middle of the house. Because of the way it curved upwards to the second floor, it created this weird, cramped little alcove underneath. For whatever reason, that space under the stairs was permanently damp, and I don't just mean a little humid. I mean, in the dead of the dry season in Saigon. You know, we only have 2 seasons here, rain and sun, and this was right around February or March, when it's so blisteringly hot outside that the asphalt practically melts. That alcove would sprout this thick, dark green moss. It would creep up the baseboards like a disease. My dad tried everything. He bought industrial-grade, waterproof paint, scraped the walls down to the brick, and sealed it. But a few weeks later, the dampness would just eat right through the paint, and the moss would be back. But honestly, we didn't care. To us, the house felt incredibly warm and cozy. We lived there for 17 entirely peaceful years without a single weird thing happening. The bizarre part was how other people reacted to it. Relatives who came over for the holidays, or even this guy I dated in my 20s, the moment they stepped through the front door, they would get this uncomfortable look on their faces. They'd constantly complain that the house felt incredibly heavy, or gloomy, or just flat out chilling. I used to get so annoyed at them. I thought it was just total crap, honestly. I'd stand in the middle of our spotless living room and think they were just being dramatic, because to me, it was just home. I didn't realize that whatever was living in that house was already messing with our heads, making us blind to it so we wouldn't leave. Everything completely fell apart in 2006. My older sister suffered a massive stroke. It was devastating. It left her entirely paralyzed on one side, and she completely lost her ability to speak. She spent weeks in the hospital, and I practically lived by her bedside. But there was this one deeply disturbing pattern. Whenever extended family came to visit, they would naturally ask what happened, trying to figure out where she was when the stroke hit. The moment anyone mentioned the word house, or specifically asked about the space under the stairs, her entire demeanor would violently shift. She couldn't talk, but her eyes would bulge out of her head, completely wide with raw terror, and then she would squint hard, letting out these awful strained groans from deep in her throat. When she was finally discharged, she had to use a wheelchair. The day we brought her home, I was rolling her through the front door. To get to the makeshift bedroom we set up for her on the ground floor, I had to push her right past the spiral staircase. As we got closer to the alcove, her entire body seized up. Despite being half paralyzed and incredibly weak, she started thrashing wildly in the chair. She was twisting her neck, trying to physically shrink away from the space under the stairs, panting heavily. She fought so hard against nothing that she literally threw herself out of the wheelchair. She hit the hard tile floor with a sickening thud. We rushed to pick her up right away, but we just rationalized it. We fed ourselves this bullshit excuse that it was just psychological trauma. See, when she initially had her stroke, it happened early in the morning. She had gone downstairs, collapsed near those very stairs, and ended up lying there completely paralyzed on the cold tiles for maybe 30 or 45 minutes before anyone in the house woke up and found her. We told ourselves she was just terrified of that spot because of the trauma of lying there helpless. We told her it was okay, that she was safe, and just wheeled her into the room. During her physical therapy, we had to do these basic exercises to get her brain to reconnect with her limbs. We actually hired a private physical therapist to come to the house, and they would manually bend her stiff joints and move her arms and legs around. One afternoon, I brought her a bowl of food and sat by her bed. She had a blank notebook resting on her lap, and she was gripping a pen with her good hand. She wasn't just writing, she was aggressively carving the pen into the paper, her hand shaking violently as she scribbled line after line. I leaned over to read it, but it was just a chaotic mess of jagged, frantic strokes. Not a single legible word. She kept pointing a trembling finger at the page, looking up at me with those desperate, pleading eyes, making those agonizing sounds in her throat. And you know what I did? I got frustrated. I told her that she was already terrible at handwriting before the stroke, and now she was just making herself exhausted over nothing. I literally snatched the notebook out of her hands, snapped it shut, and told her to stop stressing out and just eat her food so she could get her voice back and tell me properly. God, I think about that exact moment every single day of my life. The guilt is like a physical weight on my chest. I took away her only warning. I completely silenced her. About a month later, she had progressed to using an aluminum walker, but she absolutely refused to step foot outside her bedroom. If you even tried to coax her out into the hallway, she would violently shake her head no. A few days after that, I came home from work and found her dead. She was lying directly under the spiral staircase, right in the damp alcove. Her body was tightly contorted, Her limbs pulled in awkwardly, and her tongue was protruding from her mouth. It was the most horrific thing I had ever seen. The coroner took a look and told us she died from a massive heart attack. The doctor said her heart just short-circuited from being scared out of her freaking mind. She had been literally scared to death. But even then, we didn't suspect the paranormal. We were just grieving. 3 years dragged by. It was 2009. The atmosphere in the house was so suffocating that relatives kept begging my mom to sell it. They said the place felt like a tomb. My mom finally caved. She didn't really believe in ghosts, but the tragic memories were just too much. She placed an ad in the newspaper to find a buyer. Exactly 1 month later, my mom was dead. She was a perfectly healthy woman for her age. She was in her late 60s, but she was so fit and active she hadn't even claimed her pension yet, and was still going to work every single day. But we found her lifeless body in the exact same spot, under the stairs, and her face, I will never, ever forget her face. Her hands were curled up into rigid claws, but her eyes were completely blown wide, staring blankly at the ceiling, and her mouth was unhinged, hanging wide open like she had been screaming until her vocal cords snapped. It was the face of someone who had looked straight into hell before the lights went out. We brought her to the hospital, praying for a miracle, but they kept her for a few days and gave us the exact same cause of death: heart attack. I was so broken. I practically begged my dad to sell the house, and I tried putting up new listings, but nobody was biting. During that time, I ended up getting married and quickly got pregnant. But just 6 or 7 months into the pregnancy, my entire marriage inexplicably collapsed. We got a divorce. I won't go into the details, but looking back, I can't help but wonder if that thing in the house was intentionally stripping away any shred of happiness or support I had left. A couple of years later, my son was a toddler. We finally got a bite on the house. A real estate agent called and said an overseas Vietnamese guy from America wanted to buy it as an investment. He was offering straight cash, bringing huge stacks of US dollars with him, and said he'd come by at the end of the month to finalize the paperwork. I was so relieved. But right in the middle of that month, my dad died. It was just a normal morning. I was getting my son ready to drop him off at kindergarten. I patted his back and told him, "Go into the bedroom and say good morning to Grandpa." A minute later, I walked in after him, and my dad was just lying there on the bed, perfectly still. This time it wasn't under the stairs. He died right in his own bedroom, but his body was frozen stiff as a freaking board. His arms were locked, his fingers cramped together, eyes bulging, mouth locked in a silent scream. The mortuary workers literally had to douse rags in strong rubbing alcohol and aggressively scrub his cheeks and jaw for minutes just to forcefully relax the muscles enough to close his eyes and mouth. 3 family members, 8 years, all dead from sudden cardiac arrest, all wearing the same expression of absolute paralyzing horror, and naturally the buyer caught wind of the funeral and completely bailed. You would think that at this point, I would have just grabbed my kid and ran for my life, right? But this is where the psychological manipulation of that house truly shines. I didn't feel afraid. I felt this bizarre, twisted loyalty to the property. I kept telling myself it was just a string of awful medical tragedies. I even asked my little boy, who was about 4 at the time, if he wanted to move. He just smiled at me and said he loved our house, that it wasn't cold or scary at all. So, like an absolute idiot, I stayed, just me and my son, living alone with whatever was rotting under our stairs. The breaking point happened when my son was 7 years old, in the 2nd grade. It was a completely normal morning, around 6:15 a.m. or something. My kid was incredibly independent, so I was just lying in bed, being a lazy mom, watching the ceiling fan spin. I figured I'd wait until he was fully dressed and ready before I got up to drive him to school. I heard him brushing his teeth, closing the bathroom door, packing his backpack. He called out to me that he was heading downstairs to wait by my scooter. I always parked the scooter right next to the spiral staircase. I yelled back that I'd be down in a minute. I dragged myself out of bed, splashed some water on my face, threw on some clothes without even looking in the mirror, and headed for the stairs. It couldn't have been more than 3 minutes. I took the first few steps down the curve. From that angle, you can see straight into the living room, and I saw my son's legs sticking out from under the alcove. My heart completely dropped into my stomach. Holy fucking shit. I remember gasping out. My brain instantly flashed to my sister, my mom, my dad. I completely lost my mind. I didn't even run down the stairs. I practically threw myself down them, slipping and smashing my knees against the edges, tumbling all the way to the bottom. I scrambled across the floor and grabbed him. He was still wearing his little backpack. I rolled him over, screaming his name over and over again, practically shaking him. Then I saw his chest faintly rise. He was breathing. He was just out cold, dead to the world, with his eyes rolling back in his head. I shoved him into a taxi and rushed him to the emergency room. The doctor ran a bunch of tests and looked at me with this deeply confused, disturbed expression. He told me that my son's heart had literally just stopped beating for a few seconds before kicking back in. He sternly asked me if I had forced him to watch an intense horror movie, or if someone had played a sick, terrifying prank on him, because children simply do not experience that kind of heart failure unless they are exposed to a level of fear that their nervous system literally cannot process. I was dumbfounded. I told him no, of course not. They admitted my son for 3 days of observation, and that's when the veil was finally ripped off. We were in a shared hospital room with a few other patients. There was this bulky old TV mounted in the corner, and the woman in the bed next to ours was watching a classic martial arts drama, Return of the Condor Heroes. I wasn't really paying attention, just sitting anxiously by my son's bed. It was one of those later episodes, the one where the main character, Yang Guo, had already lost his arm, and he and Xiaolong Nu were doing that crazy dual sword fighting technique against the main villainess, Li Mochu. The show reached a climactic scene with this villainous character. She was an old woman, and in this specific shot, she was leaping down from a rooftop. She had this stark, pure white hair that flared wildly out to both sides as she fell through the air. I felt my son's tiny hand grip my arm. Hard. I looked at him, and all the color had completely drained from his face. He was staring at the TV, trembling. He looked up at me and whispered that the lady on the screen was exactly like the thing he saw under our stairs. My blood ran completely cold. I carefully asked him what he meant, trying not to freak him out. He told me that when he went downstairs to wait by the scooter, he heard this strange, agonizing noise coming from the alcove. He described it as a slow, heavy scraping sound, almost like thick, brittle fingernails digging deeply into the damp concrete and slowly dragging downward. He said he peeked under the stairs, into the shadows, and sitting right there in the mold was an old woman. She had pure, shocking white hair hanging in thick clumps. He said she didn't walk. She just suddenly lunged out from the darkness, hovering right above the floor. Her eyes didn't have any pupils, just milky, dead white orbs staring intensely at him. She reached out with these impossibly long, rotting fingernails, grabbed his ankle, and violently yanked him toward the dark space. He said the shock of her cold hands and that horrifying face rushing at him just made everything go black. He hadn't told me because he was too terrified to even speak about it, but seeing the character on the TV triggered the memory. Obviously, because a 7-year-old kid doesn't exactly have the vocabulary to describe a fucking demon, do they? They just borrow whatever scary image they can find. But the core details were enough to make me physically sick. That was it. That was the moment the denial completely shattered. When the hospital discharged him, I didn't even let him step foot back on that street. I took him straight to a cheap hotel room. I called up a cheap local moving crew with a cargo trike, gave them the keys and told them to pack up our entire lives in 2 days. I refused to go back inside. We moved into a cramped rental apartment, and I put the house back on the market, aggressively pushing to sell it. We ended up living out of boxes in that tiny rental for about 3 or 4 months, but eventually, a young married couple made an offer, and miraculously, I actually got a pretty normal market price for it. I didn't even have to take a massive financial hit. I took every single cent of that money, packed up our stuff, and bought a new place tucked away in an alley over in Govap district. Just me and my son, completely starting over. But honestly, selling that house felt like handing off a loaded gun, and I lived in total dread for years, secretly checking on the new owners to see if they were okay. But they've been there for almost a decade now, had a kid who's already in middle school, and absolutely nothing bad has happened to them. It made me realize the most sickening truth. That thing didn't just haunt the property, it specifically targeted my bloodline. Honestly, a ghost jumping out of a closet is a joke compared to whatever the hell that thing was that quietly manipulates your reality and mimics heart attacks to kill your parents and sister. So, I married a Korean guy way back in the day. Like, we're talking over a decade ago when I was just in my early 20s. By the time this happened, I was on my third kid, and let me tell you, the stress was absolutely eating me alive. My husband was going through some rough patches with his business. I was already exhausted from chasing 2 toddlers around, and because of all that anxiety, my milk just completely dried up. But the one saving grace was that my in-laws really took care of me, and they put me in this super VIP maternity hospital over in South Korea that felt more like a luxury hotel. Honestly, it felt like I was going on some kind of relaxing vacation instead of recovering from childbirth. Since I couldn't nurse, my mother-in-law signed me up for this night feeding service they had, where every 3 hours, like exactly at midnight, 3 a.m., and so on, a nurse would come take the baby to give them formula so I could get some actual sleep. And honestly, you really have to picture this place to understand how secure I felt, because it wasn't just a normal clinical hospital room with those depressing fluorescent lights and a roommate groaning next to you behind a thin curtain. No, this was basically a high-end penthouse suite. It was massive, with this huge plush leather sofa over by the window where my mother-in-law would crash, a massive flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, and heavy, thick soundproof doors. It was the kind of place that cost thousands of bucks a night. The kind of place where you expect absolute privacy and zero weirdness. I had delivered my first 2 kids in this exact same room. I actually requested it specifically because I liked the layout so much, so I felt completely comfortable there. It was my safe zone, you know? Having a C-section for your 3rd kid is an entirely different level of physical misery, though. Your body is just done. Every single time I had to shift my weight on that adjustable hospital bed, it felt like someone was dragging a serrated knife across my lower abdomen, and the sheer exhaustion of it all just leaves you in this weird, loopy state of mind. You don't have a normal sleep schedule anymore. You just exist in these short, painful bursts of consciousness between painkillers. The routine for the night feeding was actually really specific, and it worked like clockwork. Newborns don't have a biological clock. They don't care if it's broad daylight or the dead of night. They just wake up screaming when they're hungry. So we set up the 3-hour interval. At exactly midnight, the night nurse would come in, quietly scoop up the baby from the bassinet next to my bed, and take them down the hall to the nursery to give them a bottle of formula. She told me it usually took about 30 minutes to feed and burp the baby. When she brought the baby back, she wouldn't just barge in. The protocol was that she would knock on the door exactly 3 times. Always 3 distinct knocks. That was my cue. I would force myself to sit up, reach over and turn off the main room lights so the sudden brightness wouldn't startle the baby awake, and then I'd shuffle over in the dark, open the door, and let her in. The nurse would walk quietly through the pitch-black room, gently place the sleeping baby back into the bassinet, and slip out without us having to exchange a single word. It was a completely silent routine, designed to keep everyone asleep. So, on the second night of my stay, things started out exactly like that. My husband had gone back to our house to deal with some work stuff and check on the older kids, so it was just me, the baby, and my mother-in-law, who was already dead to the world, snoring softly on that big leather sofa on the other side of the room. Midnight rolled around, and right on schedule, the nurse came in. We left the dim lights on. She smiled, picked up my baby, and whispered that she'd be back in about half an hour. She walked out. The heavy door clicked shut behind her, and the room got insanely quiet, with that thick, heavy silence you only ever get in hospitals late at night. I couldn't fall back asleep right away because my incision was throbbing, so I grabbed the remote and turned on the TV. I had lived there long enough to be pretty fluent, so I didn't even need subtitles, and I just started flipping through channels, eventually settling on some random K-pop music show and a generic late-night drama. I was just letting the bright, flashy colors from the screen wash over the dark room, trying to distract my brain from the burning sensation in my stomach, when all of a sudden, I heard this very deliberate sound, just 3 sharp, distinct thuds echoing against the thick wood of my door. I remember staring at the door for a second, totally confused, because I immediately glanced down at the digital clock on the cable box underneath the TV, and it clearly read 12:16 a.m. I thought to myself, there is absolutely no freaking way a newborn finishes a bottle, gets burped, and falls back asleep in 16 minutes. It was way too fast. But, mom brain kicks in, and I figured maybe the baby just refused the bottle or was throwing a fit and the nurse needed me to calm them down. So, groaning and holding my stomach to keep my stitches from pulling, I swung my legs over the side of the bed. I did the routine. I grabbed the remote, shut off the TV so the room was pitch black, reached over to switch off the bedside lamp, and slowly shuffled my way across the cold floor toward the door. I grabbed the heavy metal handle, pulled the door open, and stepped back to let the nurse in. Except, there was no nurse. Standing right there in the brightly lit hallway was this woman, and I don't mean a doctor, or another patient in a gown or a janitor. It was a grown woman, and her face was completely, unnaturally pale, like she had literally taken a cheap tub of skin bleaching cream and smeared it an inch thick across every inch of her skin. It was chalky and weird, but the thing that really threw me off, the thing that made my brain just completely short-circuit, was that she was wearing a hanbok, like a full traditional, heavily embroidered Korean national dress. The kind of massive bell-shaped gown you only ever wear to formal weddings or major traditional holidays. I just stood there in the doorway, barefoot in the dark, staring out at her in the bright hallway, completely stunned. We just looked at each other in total silence for what felt like an eternity, probably only 5 seconds, but it felt so long, and I was just trying to process why the hell someone was walking around a VIP maternity ward at midnight dressed like they were going to a historical parade. Then, she blinked, looked at me with this totally blank expression, and said in a very casual, almost polite Korean voice, "Oh, I'm sorry, I have the wrong room." She didn't wait for me to reply. She just turned around. I was so taken aback that I didn't even say anything. I just awkwardly scratched my head, muttered something under my breath about people being crazy, and slowly pulled the door shut. I locked it, waddled back to my bed, climbed under the covers, and grabbed the remote to turn the TV back on. My mind was just spinning trying to rationalize it. I kept telling myself that maybe someone's eccentric grandmother had come to visit a new baby down the hall and got lost. But even then, who the hell wears a giant restrictive traditional gown to a hospital in the middle of the night? It was so weird, but I was so tired I just chalked it up to sleep deprivation and tried to focus on the TV screen. A few minutes went by. I was just starting to relax my muscles again when the sound cut through the room a second time. 3 more sharp, heavy thuds against the wood of the door. I looked at the clock again. It was 12:20 a.m. Now I was getting a little annoyed. I figured, okay, maybe it actually is the nurse this time, or maybe that crazy lady in the dress got turned around again. I hit the power button on the TV, plunging the room into darkness once more, held my aching stomach, and marched back over to the door. I swung it open, fully expecting to see the nurse in her scrubs. But nope, it was her again, the exact same woman in the hanbok. But this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't just standing there looking confused. The second the door opened, she immediately locked eyes with me and smiled. And when she smiled, I noticed her lips were painted this grotesque, vibrant shade of crimson red that stood out so sharply against her chalky white face it actually made my stomach drop. She tilted her head to the side, her eyes crinkling up into these thin little slits, and she just stared at me with this sickeningly sweet, almost mocking expression. "I have the wrong room," she said again, but this time her voice was totally different. It wasn't apologetic anymore. It sounded amused, like she thought this was some kind of hilarious inside joke that only she understood. Before I could even open my mouth to ask her what her freaking problem was, she turned away and started walking down the hall. And as she walked, my brain struggled to comprehend what I was seeing, because the skirt of a hanbok is incredibly wide and long. It sweeps the floor, right? But the way she was moving, she was bobbing up and down in this unnatural, jerky, almost spring-like motion, dipping and rising with every step. But looking down at the hem of her massive dress, I couldn't see any feet. There were no shoes, no footsteps on the linoleum. Just this giant mound of fabric floating and bobbing away from me down the sterile corridor. A cold shiver shot straight up my spine. I slammed the door shut so hard it rattled the frame, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. I told myself she was just some mentally unwell patient, maybe someone from the psychiatric wing who wandered off, and her feet were just hidden under the fabric. You know how your brain desperately tries to build a logical bridge when you see something terrifying? That's what I was doing. I was gaslighting myself. I scrambled back into bed, pulled the blankets up to my chin, and cranked the volume on the TV just to drown out the silence, absolutely terrified that I was going to hear that knocking again. And then, a few minutes later, the silence was completely shattered when I heard those 3 deliberate, heavy thuds against the wood of my door again, making me practically jump out of my skin as I whipped my head toward the clock. 12:27 a.m. Almost 30 minutes had passed since the baby was taken. That was the exact time the nurse said she would be back. But my nerves were completely shot. There was no way in hell I was just blindly throwing that door open again for that creepy woman in the dress. I forced myself out of bed, crept across the dark room, and instead of reaching for the handle, I pressed my eye right up against the little glass peephole in the center of the door. I held my breath and peered out into the distorted fisheye view of the hallway, and I let out a massive trembling sigh of relief. Through the curved glass, I could clearly see the familiar blue scrubs of the night nurse. She was standing there, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in a hospital blanket, her head bowed down slightly, as if she was looking at the sleeping baby in her arms. It was her. Thank God, it was just the nurse. All the tension instantly drained out of my shoulders. I felt so stupid for being so paranoid. I reached over, flicked off the main light switch by the door to keep the room dark for the baby, and then slowly pulled the door open. Because I had already verified it was the nurse through the peephole, and because I was so desperate to just get back to bed before the pain in my stomach flared up again, I didn't even bother looking at her. I didn't check. I just opened the door wide, turned my back to the hallway, and immediately started walking back toward my bed. I expected her to just silently follow me in, put the baby in the bassinet, and leave, just like the protocol demanded. But as I was taking those slow, agonizing steps in the pitch-black room, my bare feet padding softly against the floor, I heard something right behind me. It wasn't the soft, rubber-soled squeak of a nurse's walking shoes. It was the heavy, rustling drag of thick fabric. Swish, drag, swish, drag. And it was close. It was right on my heels. I could almost feel the displacement of air against my back. It felt like the person carrying my baby was practically breathing down my neck. I didn't stop, though. I just kept my eyes locked on the edge of my mattress, gritting my teeth against the pain in my incision, and finally, I reached the bed. I carefully climbed up, gripping the sheets, and slowly lowered my weight down onto the mattress. The moment my backside hit the bed, I let out a breath, and I turned my upper body around, expecting to see the nurse standing by the bassinet gently lowering my child down. But there was no nurse. There was no baby. Standing right there, less than 2 feet away from the edge of my bed, towering over me in the darkness of my room, was the woman in the hanbok. The white face, the red lips, the dead, staring eyes. She was inside. She was right beside me. And before my brain could even completely snap from the absolute nightmare of what I was looking at, before I could even draw breath to scream for my mother-in-law, the woman lunged. She didn't just reach for me. She threw her entire body forward, her arms snapping out, and she violently shoved my shoulders backward. I hit the mattress hard, the breath completely knocked out of my lungs, and in the next split second, she scrambled up onto the bed and dropped her entire weight directly onto my stomach. It wasn't a ghostly, ethereal chill. It was heavy. It was a solid, crushing mass of physical weight dropping like a boulder straight down onto my freshly sliced, barely stitched abdomen. I let out this horrific, gargling shriek because the pain was so sudden and so blindingly intense it felt like a bomb had gone off inside my pelvis. It was just pure, unadulterated fucking agony. I could literally feel the skin of my stomach stretching and ripping under her weight. At the same time, the massive, heavy layers of her traditional dress collapsed forward, completely smothering my face. It smelled like old dust and rotting fabric, blocking out all the air in the room, pressing into my mouth and nose so I couldn't even scream anymore. I was trapped under her, thrashing blindly, the white-hot pain from my C-section shooting up my spine and frying every nerve ending in my body. I tried to push her off. I tried to buck my hips, but she felt like she weighed 300 pounds, just grinding down into my open wound. The pain was too much. It was just too much. I only managed to fight for maybe 5 or 6 seconds before the darkness at the edges of my vision rapidly closed in, my brain simply shutting off to escape the torture, and I completely blacked out. I don't know how long I was out. When I finally dragged my eyes open, the room was blindingly bright. The main overhead lights were on. I was gasping for air, clutching my stomach in a cold sweat, wildly looking around for the woman in the dress. But she was gone. Instead, my mother-in-law was standing right next to my bed, looking down at me with this extremely irritated expression, and just behind her stood the actual night nurse, looking incredibly awkward while rocking my baby in her arms. My mother-in-law started scolding me in Korean, her voice sharp and loud. She snapped at me, demanding to know what my problem was while pointing at the door. She completely went off on me, complaining that the poor nurse had been standing out in the freezing cold hallway holding her grandson, just knocking and banging for 5 minutes straight. She grumbled about how she had to wake up and drag herself over to let the nurse in because I was just sitting there ignoring them. I just stared at her, my mouth opening and closing like a fish. The nurse had been locked out? If the nurse was out there banging on the door, then who the hell did I let in? Who did I see through the peephole? I started hyperventilating, the realization crashing over me like a tidal wave. I didn't even try to explain the ghost right then, because my mind was completely shattered. I just grabbed my mother-in-law's arm, my hands trembling uncontrollably, and begged her, absolutely pleaded with her, not to turn off the lights. I told her I didn't care if it kept the baby awake. I didn't care about anything. I just needed the lights on. I spent the rest of that night huddled against the headboard, staring wide-eyed at the locked door, jumping at every single sound from the hallway, terrified that the handle was going to turn. The next morning, when we were finally in the car heading home, I just spilled everything to my husband and my mother-in-law. I was shaking the whole time, but my mother-in-law didn't even look that surprised, and she explained that in Korean folklore, when older women die, their spirits often manifest wearing those exact traditional hanbok dresses, kind of like how in the West, people always see ghosts in Victorian nightgowns. It made my blood run cold, but the absolute worst part was the physical damage. A few days later, I was in so much agony, I had to go back to the doctor, and it turned out the sheer weight of that thing sitting on me had literally popped my C-section stitches open, and they had to redo them. I told my husband right then and there, if we ever miraculously have a fourth kid, I am never, ever stepping foot in that hospital again. I still remember the exact policy they drilled into my head on my very first night working at that sketchy restaurant. They told me that once you're assigned to a private karaoke room, You are completely bound to it until the guests decide to leave. You couldn't take other tables or wander off. You were essentially held hostage by whatever mob bosses or shady businessmen rented the space, forced to smile and turn a blind eye while they did whatever twisted crap they wanted. The pay was garbage, but the tips were crazy, so you just learned to swallow your pride, stare at the wall, and act like a piece of furniture. I'm in my early 40s now, but back in 2007, I was just a broke 20-something college kid who just moved to Saigon from the provinces. Life was incredibly tough back then. Finding a decent part-time job was a nightmare, because most employers hated hiring students. They thought we were lazy and would just quit whenever exams rolled around. I actually bounced around a few dead-end gigs for months before a buddy of mine finally hooked me up with this place, so I actually had to lie during my interview. I hid my student ID, put on this whole act, complaining about how poor my family was back home and how I desperately needed the money to survive. That was the only reason the manager let me in. The place was this massive, multi-level Chinese restaurant right near the Fudong intersection. It had been around since before the year 2000, famous for serving a really wild mix of customers. We're talking high-end executives, sketchy underground mob guys, and even off-duty cops. These were the kind of heavy hitters who rolled up in expensive cars, the kind of faces you'd usually only see in newspaper headlines. The restaurant management knew perfectly well that these guys threw cash around just to show off, so they used that as a filthy excuse to pay us a practically non-existent base salary. It was purely exploitative, but the older waiters told me to shut up and stop worrying about the paycheck. They said the real money was in the tips. The culture inside those VIP rooms was something else. You'd stand in the corner like a statue, and whenever a guest needed ice, you'd rush over with the tongs. Or they'd ask for a cold towel. And back in those days, we didn't have those cheap, pre-packaged wet wipes. We had these thick frozen towels wrapped in clear plastic. You had to take the towel, give it a really hard snap with your hands to pop the plastic bag with a loud smack, and then unroll it for the guest. If you did that smoothly and smiled, they'd casually toss you a 50,000 dong bill. That was roughly a couple of bucks back then, all in paper money since polymer notes weren't fully everywhere yet. On my very first night, I remember getting tipped in these crumpled up 5,000 and 10,000 dong bills, scraping together maybe 30 or 40 grand, and I was thrilled. If you got tipped just a few times a night, you could make around 15 million dong a month. That was an absolute fortune back then, enough to buy an entire tael of solid gold. Everyone fought tooth and nail for the VIP room shifts. Originally, the restaurant just had an open dining floor on the bottom level, and the second and third floors were just empty spaces where the staff used to sleep. But the owner, who was heavily connected with the local underworld, realized that his wealthy clients wanted privacy. They wanted closed doors, air conditioning, karaoke machines, and young VIP bottle girls to sit with them. So he completely gutted the upper floors and built these massive VIP rooms, each featuring a massive table built to sit 10 to 12 people. When I started working there, the rooms were so new that the smell of fresh industrial paint was still burning my nostrils. On my 5th or 6th day, my manager assigned me to a newly finished room on the 2nd floor. The rule was strict. When they said you belonged to that room, you didn't leave until the bill was paid. But here's the catch. When the guests started getting drunk and too hands-on with the working girls, they obviously didn't want the waitstaff standing there staring at them. So, whenever things got wild and inappropriate inside, I was expected to step out and give them privacy. I'd pull up a tiny plastic stool right outside the heavy glass door in the hallway. I was still locked to serving only that room, just sitting there in the cold AC, peeking through the glass, waiting for someone inside to point at an empty ice bucket so I could rush back in. A group of 4 men walked in around 7 p.m. Actually, wait, I think it might have been 5 guys initially, but 1 left early. Yeah, whatever, it doesn't matter. There were 4 left in the room. They looked like serious trouble, the kind of guys you read about in the crime section of the newspaper. I spent the first 2 hours just running back and forth, opening green glass bottles of Heineken, filling ice buckets, and staying out of their way. But these guys were incredibly cheap. They were buying drinks for the bottle girls who were all wearing these tight silk cheongsams with dangerously deep thigh slits, but they completely ignored me. I even had to mop up a puddle of vomit from one of the guys right there on the floor, and they still didn't toss me a single coin. Not a single tip came my way, and I was getting pretty annoyed, just standing in the cold air conditioning feeling sorry for myself. I noticed one of the guests was acting really hostile. He was a short, heavy guy with a bald spot, a massive beer belly, and this weird mole right on his upper lip, with one long, gross hair hanging off it like a dog leash. The other guys called him Sonny. He kept aggressively complaining to the bottle girls, telling them they were nowhere near as pretty as a girl named Cassie. He kept comparing their figures, loudly criticizing them, praising Cassie's big boobs, tiny waist, and fat ass, saying her skin was cool to the touch, and drunkenly rambling about how he should have dragged her to a hotel when he had the chance. I watched as Haley, one of the VIP bottle girls sitting next to him, went completely pale. She nervously stuttered and tried to calm him down, whispering that Cassie had refused to take any more clients and was eventually fired and sent back to her hometown. She begged him to just let it go, but the guy wouldn't drop it. He kept ranting about how they should have trapped her in debt and beaten the stubbornness out of her until she served them, saying it was a total waste to send a body like that back to the countryside to farm. By the time the clock hit maybe 9:15 p.m., the room was a total mess. They'd emptied 3 or 4 entire crates of glass beer bottles. The music was deafening, the bass was vibrating through my chest, and the guys were completely wasted. 2 of them were passed out on the leather sofa, and another guy was slouched over the table holding a microphone, dragging out this cheesy, out-of-tune love song like, "I miss you." I was sitting on my small stool right outside the heavy glass door, just waiting for someone to yell for more ice. Suddenly, the door violently burst open. Haley and 2 other bottle girls came sprinting out into the hallway. Their faces were chalk white, and they were hyperventilating. They grabbed my shirt and frantically whispered that the bald guy, Sonny, had been possessed by Cassie. I honestly thought they were joking. I was young, totally fearless, and I didn't believe in the supernatural at all. I figured the drunk old guy probably just got a little too handsy and scared the working girls. I rolled my eyes and pushed past them into the room to see what the big deal was. The air inside the room felt incredibly heavy and freezing cold. The music had stopped playing, leaving this dead, suffocating silence. The guy who had just been singing was so wasted he didn't even realize the track had ended. He was just sitting there in the dead quiet, blindly punching numbers into one of those old-school Ari-Rang karaoke remotes to pick the next song, completely oblivious to what was happening. I looked around the large table and realized the bald guy was missing from his seat. Then I heard a sickening crunching sound coming from the floor. I leaned over and looked under the massive dining table. It was a large 4-legged table, so it was pretty spacious underneath. The floor was covered in broken green glass from smashed beer bottles, and right in the middle of that mess, Sonny, the overweight mob boss, was crawling on his hands and knees. I couldn't process what I was looking at. He was maneuvering through the sharp glass, his stomach dragging on the floor, and he was making these slow, exaggerated feminine movements. I'm not going to spell it out, but you know exactly what kind of motion a cheap hooker makes under a table, right? It was being performed by a 50-year-old mafia guy. It was the most deeply unsettling, depraved thing I had ever witnessed. He slowly reached down and unbuckled his leather belt, pulling his shirt out of his trousers. My brain immediately tried to rationalize it. Back in 2007, seeing something like that was a huge shock, so I genuinely thought maybe these tough guys were secretly playing some weird, submissive gay role play behind closed doors. But then I heard his voice. It wasn't his deep, raspy grunt anymore. It was pitched up, breathy, and dripping with this unnatural sweetness that made my stomach tie into knots. "It's Cassie, boys. Let me relax you. Don't you remember me?" He crawled out from under the table and practically lunged at his passed-out friends. The guy on the sofa woke up, his eyes widening in absolute horror as his buddy started caressing his chest and trying to kiss his neck. The possessed man kept whispering Cassie's name over and over, wrapping his arms around his friends, acting completely unhinged and deeply inappropriate. The other guests were completely paralyzed with shock. One of them scrambled away, yelling at Sonny, asking what the hell he was doing, screaming that they had been drinking buddies for years and he never knew Sonny was into men. But the entity inside Sonny just giggled. She stared right at the terrified friend and spoke through the mobster's mouth. "It is Cassie. Weren't you fighting over me the other day? Didn't you tell my boss to beat me until I served you? Well, I am here to serve you now." Sonny just kept rubbing his own chest, making these disgusting squelching sounds, literally pinching his own nipples before trying to force his fingers into his friend's mouth. What the absolute fuck, right? The whole ordeal lasted for maybe 3 endless minutes before he suddenly gasped. His body went entirely rigid, and he collapsed backward into a chair. He ripped his own shirt open in a daze, stared at the ceiling for a second, and then passed out cold. When he finally came to a few minutes later, he had absolutely no memory of what just happened. He looked down at his unbuckled pants and his torn shirt in total confusion, angrily slurring at his friends, demanding to know why the hell they had stripped him while he was passed out. The panic in the room was contagious. His friends instantly sobered up, grabbed him by the arms, and dragged him out of the room. They ordered me to call a 7-seater Milan taxi right away. Before they sped off into the night, one of the guys grabbed me by the collar and aggressively warned me to keep my mouth shut about everything I saw. After they left, we all gathered at a street noodle cart in a dark alley behind the restaurant. We were just squatting on these tiny plastic stools past midnight, and the clinking of the wooden spoons against the porcelain bowls was the only normal sound keeping me grounded. I begged the bottle girls to explain what the hell I had just witnessed. They were terrified of the owner finding out, but they eventually cracked. If any of you listening have ever worked in a place that has a deeply buried, violent history, you know that the building itself almost feels like it's trying to tell you the truth. If you've ever felt that heavy, oppressive energy in a room where something terrible happened, please tell me I'm not crazy in the comments. Because for the longest time, I thought my mind was just playing tricks on me. They told me that Cassie was the most gorgeous high-end escort the restaurant ever had. The unspoken rule in that joint was that bottle girls were strictly 17 to 20 years old. Once you hit 21, you were considered washed up, pushed aside to just play scratch cards in the corner instead of serving the high rollers. But Cassie was the exception. She was a total diva. She knew she was the main attraction, and she refused to entertain any guest who tipped less than $100. Her motto was literally, "I choose the clients, they don't choose me." She even rejected clients based on their looks. She would literally just claim it was her time of the month to avoid them and go shopping for designer clothes down on Wintray Street instead. And that creepy crawling routine under the table? The working girls told me that was actually Cassie's signature move when she was alive. A twisted little game she played to get the rich clients completely hooked on her. But it got worse. Since her death, guests would frequently complain about terrifying hallucinations. A group of 3 guys would hire 3 working girls, but after getting totally wasted, they'd suddenly realize there were 4 girls sitting on the sofa with them. Then, that extra girl would slowly slide off the couch and crawl under the table to unbuckle their belts. They'd think it was a fun new trick, right up until they looked under the table and saw a rotting ghost face staring back at them. The bald mob boss who got possessed was actually the main protection guy for our restaurant. He was powerful, dangerous, and incredibly ugly. He had requested Cassie 3 separate times, and she rejected him every single time. On that 4th night, when she gave him the same excuse, he completely lost his mind. He started screaming that it was impossible for a woman to have her period every single day of the month. He stormed out of the VIP room, marched straight up the stairs to the staff sleeping quarters, and dragged her out of bed. He beat her mercilessly. The working girls said he took something sharp and destroyed her beautiful face so she could never look down on anyone again. The owner of the restaurant ran upstairs to intervene, but the mobster threatened to cut his head off and burn the business to the ground if Cassie wasn't permanently dealt with by morning. The owner forced all the other bottle girls to grab their blankets and sleep downstairs in the empty lobby. Throughout the entire night, they laid there in the dark, listening to Cassie screaming and crying, begging the men to stop. She promised she'd do whatever they wanted, sobbing that she would happily perform all 69 positions if they just let her live. But the wet, heavy thwacks of flesh being whipped and slapped just continued until the building went dead silent. The next morning, the owner casually announced that Cassie had been put on a bus at the Yanante station back to her village, but one of the working girls had gotten up to use the bathroom in the middle of the night. Since the restaurant didn't have an elevator, she had to take the stairs. From the landing, she peeked out the window and saw the owner's bodyguards carrying a long, heavy, human-sized bag completely wrapped in silver duct tape. They shoved it into the trunk of a car and drove off. A few weeks after that night, the owner ordered massive renovations. He converted the staff bedrooms on the second and third floors into the brand new VIP rooms. He built the exact room I was standing in right over the spot where her blood had soaked into the floorboards. He tried to bury the crime scene under thick layers of concrete and fresh paint. He even brought in underground shamans to exorcise the place, but her spirit was too furious to be banished. But you can't just paint over a murdered girl's rage. Cassie never left. I was absolutely sick to my stomach hearing this, but I convinced myself that the ghost only targeted the men who hurt her. I was just a broke college kid serving drinks. I told myself I was safe. I was so incredibly stupid. A couple of weeks later, it was a packed Friday night. The restaurant was completely chaotic. A table of businessmen took a liking to me and aggressively forced me to drink 4 or 5 green bottles of Tiger and Heineken with them. I had zero tolerance back then. By 10 p.m., the room was spinning, my vision was blurring, and I felt the bile rising in my throat. I stumbled out of the room to find a bathroom so I could force myself to throw up and sober up. The layout of the building was a total nightmare. On the second floor, the men's room was on the right, but I was working on the third floor that night, and for some ridiculous reason, they flipped the plumbing, so the men's room was on the left. I was so dizzy and disoriented that I wandered up the hallway and kicked open the door on the right, completely unaware I was walking into the women's restroom. I collapsed over the toilet bowl and just started violently dry heaving. The cold porcelain felt good against my sweating forehead. I was coughing and spitting when I heard the heavy wooden door creak open behind me. I heard wet footsteps slowly padding across the tile floor, and then the squeak of the sink faucet turning on. I didn't care. I assumed it was one of the bottle girls taking a break. I was still retching into the bowl when I suddenly felt a hand gently land on the back of my neck. It was a deeply professional touch, the kind of soft, practiced caress the high-end escorts used on clients. I could feel the cold tips of long acrylic nails lightly scraping down my spine. I groaned, thinking Haley had taken pity on me and followed me in to help me sober up. I finally emptied my stomach. If you've ever thrown up from drinking too much, you know that horrible feeling when you stand back up. You see stars, and the whole room spins like crazy. I wiped my mouth, grabbed the edges of the stall, and slowly pushed myself up on shaky legs. I turned around, squinting through the harsh fluorescent light, and saw a girl standing right by the sink. Her head was tilted down, and her long black hair was falling over her face as she quietly sobbed into her hands. I stumbled out of the stall, genuinely concerned. I slurred my words, asking if she was okay, asking if she was Haley or Maya, and if some aggressive client had hurt her or refused to tip. She stopped crying. The bathroom fell into a suffocating silence. The water was still running from the faucet. She kept her face pointed at the floor, but her voice echoed perfectly clear off the bathroom tiles. "It's me, Cassie. You were looking for me yesterday and now you don't even know who I am?" My drunk brain couldn't process the name. I took another step forward, waving my hand dismissively, telling her to stop messing around and just look up so I could recognize her. She slowly raised her head, sweeping her hair back with her pale hands. "It's Cassie. I am Cassie." She suddenly lunged at me, closing the distance in a split second. She threw her freezing arms around my neck, pressing her body completely against mine. She leaned in, sucking on my earlobe like some depraved, sex-crazed maniac, making this awful, wet slurping sound. The smell hit me instantly. It was the overwhelming stench of cheap floral perfume completely masking the heavy metallic smell of rotting meat. I panicked. I grabbed her by the shoulders and shoved her away from me as hard as I could. She stumbled back into the harsh light, and for the first time, I clearly saw her face. She had this perfectly straight nose and peach-shaped lips, but her skin was a sickening, bloated shade of purple. Her lips were a dark, unnatural blue, like someone who had suffocated to death, and carved across her cheeks and forehead were deep, jagged lacerations, thick with dried, black blood that looked like someone had repeatedly dragged a broken bottle across her flesh. She just stood there, her eyes bulging out of her skull, her jaw hanging open as she kept whispering my name. I completely lost my grip on reality. The sheer terror paralyzed my lungs. I literally screamed, "Holy fucking shit," as I took one step back. My knees buckled, and I hit the wet tile floor, passing out instantly. I woke up a while later to the sounds of the bottle girls slapping my face and splashing cold water on me. I was completely hysterical, screaming that I had just seen Cassie. The working girls immediately shushed me, looking around in absolute terror. They called me a crazy outsider running my mouth about things I didn't understand, begging me not to say her name out loud in the building. I stuck around for maybe another month. Back in those days, gold was incredibly cheap, and hoarding physical gold was exactly how working-class people invested their savings. Honestly, it was kind of like how people treat crypto today. I just wanted to survive long enough to save up my tip money, buy a solid tail of gold, and get the hell out. The toxic, backstabbing drama among the staff finally pushed me over the edge, and I completely cut ties with that District 1 joint. But the exhaustion from those graveyard shifts still haunts me. I'll be in my room, half asleep, listening to the hum of the AC, just trying to find some peace. Then the white noise sort of warps, pulling me back into that cramped, freezing bathroom. And just before I lose consciousness, I can almost feel cold, dead lips against my earlobe, whispering, "Cassie is right here."